Chapter 686. The black group of carriages was surrounded by twinkling torches that lit up the road. However, the group was too long. Even though the Dajo Yamen had come out in full force, the aces from the 13 Yamens led by the 3 internal court eunuchs could only cut off half of the group of carriages. They had no way of surrounding the entire group. However, these officials' eyes were fixed on the court criminal. They were not worried that this bloody man with his wife and child would disappear from their sight. However, no one dared to rush forward and grab the Gundam. This was because everyone sensed something strange. The person carrying the criminal was clearly not an ordinary person. The official robes he wore were somewhat familiar to everyone. Most importantly, this long group of black carriages. Although the style of the carriages looked normal, a group of over 30 carriages was not a sight that could be seen at any time. Even the stupidest person could guess that there were important figures in the group. The officials of the 13 offices of the Ministry of Justice secretly spat and cursed their bad luck. They had never thought that they would run into such a strange group of carriages outside the remote Dajo city. They had just been extremely lucky and had finally captured a criminal of the imperial court that the court had been secretly searching for a long time. The officials of the Ministry of Justice did not panic. Although they temporarily did not know the identity of this group of carriages, they were acting on the orders of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. They could be considered half an imperial mission. Who in the world dared to stop them? Even if the people in this group of black carriages were nobles in the court, they could not criticize the court's actions in capturing a criminal. 3 internal court eunuchs walked out of the crowd, surrounded by torches. The old eunuch at the front narrowed his eyes and looked at the strange group of carriages. He looked at the court criminal covered in blood, lying on the flat ground in front of the carriage. A few people in black official robes seemed to be treating him. The mute woman with a deathly pale face was holding her child and looking nervously at the criminal. The internal court ace's eyes narrowed. His nose twitched slightly. He felt a glimmer of surprise and unease. He had easily recognized the people in black official robes in the carriages and which side they belonged to. During the battle, although Gouda had bravely charged onto the road and heavily injured 2 internal court aces, he himself was at the end of his strength. He had to protect the wife on his back and the child in his arms. There were many wounds on his body that should not have appeared. The internal court ace who was in charge of the arrest also felt his chi and blood churn. He could not calm down for a moment. He looked at the convoy in front of him and frowned slightly. Of course, he wouldn't be too arrogant. He was just a little afraid. As an internal court ace with orders from the emperor, even if this group of carriages truly belonged to the Overwatch Council, he had nothing to be afraid of. The problem was, he didn't know the rank of this group of carriages in the Overwatch Council. Most importantly, the criminal the court wanted was Tiger Guard Gouda, who had once been Sir Fan Jr.'s trusted bodyguard. If the Overwatch Council discovered this, and Sir Fan Jr. was in this group of carriages, the eunuch took a deep breath and slowly walked forward under the light of the torch. Facing the pure black carriage on the road, he said in a raspy voice, "Internal court Ichigan has come by imperial edict to capture a criminal." He didn't first ask about the identity of this group of carriages. Instead, he took the initiative to state his identity and purpose of coming. Thus, if the black group of carriages made any strange movements, the internal court would have a head start. The aces of the 13 Yamens of the Ministry of Justice gradually realized that something was wrong. They were no longer as confident as before. Instead, they spread out warily around the carriage. However, the soldiers of the Dajo Yamen were confused. These men from Jingdo all had their eyes on top of their heads. Even when faced with the court criminal who was like a vicious tiger, no one would take a step back. Why were they so cautious when faced with this black group of carriages? Criminal. The Overwatch Council official squatting by Gao Da's side and tending to his injuries suddenly furrowed his brows. Hearing the internal court eunuch's words, a complicated emotion suddenly flashed through his eyes. Gazing at the unconscious Gao Da, he muttered to himself in a low voice, "So, you also slipped away back then." The internal court eunuch did not receive a reply, but this was within his expectations. The Overwatch Council's actions had always been secretive. Once they went up against the major yamens of the court, they became unusually arrogant and unreasonable. Although the internal court had the function of supervising the Overwatch Council in name, with the deliberate connivance of Chun Pingping and Fan Xian, the previous two directors, the Overwatch Council was not very afraid of the internal court. Which official of the council is in the group of carriages? Is there something important? The internal court eunuch's eyelids drooped slightly. Coldly, he said, "Please hand this criminal to the internal court to deal with." There were more than 30 carriages. No one knew how many officials, secret agents, or important items they carried. For the Overwatch Council to pull out more than 30 specially made carriages, if they were not protecting a particularly important person in the council, then they were responsible for a very important mission. Although this eunuch was an ace of the internal court, he did not want to affect the Overwatch Council's affairs. He was particularly afraid that his luck would be so bad that he would run into Sir Fan Jr. outside Dojo. The Overwatch Council official crouching by Gao Da's side slowly rose. Facing the blinding light of the torch, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the internal court ace. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "I am the deputy head of the second bureau of the Overwatch Council. Please show me your edict." The internal court eunuch's temple suddenly throbbed with a burning sensation. He had not thought that after he and his group had revealed their identities, this Overwatch Council official would still want to see the edict he carried with him. The Overwatch Council was not afraid of the internal court, and the internal court was even less afraid of the Overwatch Council. They were only afraid of the two directors of the Overwatch Council. In front of the Emperor, these two directors carried more weight than the entire internal court combined. Thus, in their daily interactions, the internal court was polite to the Overwatch Council, and the Overwatch Council did not want to offend the internal court. For this Overwatch Council official to say such a thing in a situation like this, it appeared incomparably tyrannical. Involuntarily, it made the internal court eunuch's heart tremble. This was very different from the Overwatch Council's usual style. Was there really? Is Sir Fan Jr. in the carriages? Please allow me to come forward and pay my respects. The internal court eunuch gritted his teeth. Although the Overwatch Council was powerful, he was not afraid. He was only afraid that Sir Fan Jr. was truly in the carriages. Otherwise, why would this official be so cold and stubborn? The director is currently working in Dongi. The Overwatch Council official furrowed his brows and glanced at him. It was as if he had not expected the other party to start probing so quickly. Coldly, he said, "Since we are all working for the court, is there a problem with me wanting to see your seal?" Hearing that Fan Xian was not in the carriages, the internal court eunuch's heart immediately calmed. Although the Overwatch Council was terrifying, it was, after all, the Emperor's special forces. They did not have the courage to stop the internal court from doing things. When does the internal court need to report to the Overwatch Council for internal court matters? The internal court eunuch's face gradually darkened. In a raspy voice, he said, "Someone take this court criminal into custody." After giving this order, his eyes moved to the face of the deputy head of the second bureau. His gaze seemed to be tangible as he tried to intimidate him. At this moment, the internal court was working with the 13 yamens. If the Overwatch Council insisted on forcefully interfering, what was the difference between that and rebellion? During this year, he had been sent by the Emperor to serve under Scholar He and endlessly pursued Gao Da through the mountains and fields of the Qin Kingdom. He had never returned to Jingdo, so he did not know much about the Overwatch Council. He only knew that Sir Fan Jr. had indeed been busy with the matter of Dongi submitting. He didn't know who this black carriage might be carrying. The aces of the Ministry of Justice's 13 yamens met each other's eyes. They all saw the wariness and unease in each other's eyes. They knew that everyone in the carriage was an official of the Overwatch Council. The officials of the 6 ministries and 3 temples all had an innate fear and resistance toward the Overwatch Council. Normally, these officials of the Ministry of Justice would not, no matter what, directly oppose the Overwatch Council. However, they were working for the court. Furthermore, countless eyes were looking at the blood-soaked criminal lying among the Overwatch Council officials. They were much more confident than before. The officials of the Ministry of Justice slowly and steadily moved toward the side of the carriage. The Overwatch Council officials beside the carriage did not make any movements. It was as if they also felt that they shouldn't fall out with the entire internal court and the Ministry of Justice for a court criminal. The people surrounding them all let out a breath at the same time. They watched as a few officials of the Ministry of Justice had already walked to Tiger Guard Gauda's side. They took out the shackles and were preparing to put on the shackles. The Overwatch Council official, who had been silent and furrowed his brows the entire time, suddenly opened his mouth and said, "That's still not right. If you say he's a court criminal, then he's a court criminal? You're a eunuch of the internal court, not an official of the Supreme Court." Immediately after, he waved his hand. A number of cold lights flashed. The Overwatch Council officials around Gauda still had their hand behind their backs and did not move. From the darkness around the carriage, a few swordsmen swept out like a gust of wind. In a flash, they drew their swords and placed them across the necks of the officials of the Ministry of Justice. The faces of the officials of the Ministry of Justice immediately paled. They had been careful the entire time. They had not expected that such powerful aces were hidden in the seemingly distant darkness around the road illuminated by the torches. Before they could even make a move, they had been subdued by the other party. The internal court ace slowly raised his head and narrowed his eyes. His pupils constricted slightly as he looked at the movement in front of him. He looked at the swordsman completely shrouded in black clothing and couldn't help but feel a glimmer of coldness. The assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council truly lived up to their reputation. However, he was not afraid at all. Looking at the deputy head of the 2nd Bureau, he coldly said, "It looks like you also know the identity of this criminal and that he was Director Fan's trusted aide." What was killing people? This was killing people. The hundreds of people present all heard these words. No one could kill everyone to silence them. As long as the Overwatch Council stopped the internal court from capturing this criminal, then the rumors added to Fan Xian's name would naturally travel to Jingdo. The Overwatch Council official lowered his head slightly and thought for a moment. He then said, "Stupid old eunuch, I don't care what you say. You said you were acting by imperial edict, so I want to see your seal. Even if you don't have it, you still have to show me the Ministry of Justice's wanted notice. Otherwise, if I say you are a bandit who has brought disaster to your village, what excuse do you have?" After saying this, a cold smile rose to the corners of the official's lips. He appeared icy and confident. Standing behind everyone, the Dajo Jijo was the highest-ranking official. However, he knew that there was something fishy about this matter. Furthermore, it involved the Overwatch Council, the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the Internal Court, and the Ministry of Justice. As a mere Jijo of a small province, how could he involve himself in this? Hearing about the bandit, the Jijo couldn't help but smile bitterly. The people of the Overwatch Council were indeed shameless and ruthless. In front of so many court officials, they dared to call an internal court eunuch a bandit. Capturing Gauda and Wang Qinian had always been a secret matter that Yi Zhongwei had secretly carried out. He wanted to hide this matter until the end, so that once the conflict between the Emperor and Fan Xian exploded, there would be no chance to turn it around. Thus, he had not reported it to the Emperor ahead of time. Of course, it was impossible for him to have the Emperor's personal seal. Furthermore, he did not dare to let Fan Xian's powerful subordinates know of his plans. Thus, everything was done in secret. There wasn't even a Ministry of Justice wanted notice. If he captured Gauda or Wang Qinian, it would be easy to make up for these procedures later. However, the Overwatch Council official had sharp eyes and immediately saw the problem. With one sentence, he forced the internal court and the Ministry of Justice's special department officials to the foot of the mountain. The internal court eunuch was silent for a moment. He could not bring out the Emperor's edict or the Ministry of Justice's wanted notice, but he could not just watch as Gauda, a court criminal, slipped away in front of his eyes. My identity is naturally verified by the officials of the Ministry of Justice. All the officials of the Ministry of Justice have tokens with them. The internal court eunuch coldly turned the matter in another direction. If the Overwatch Council wants to stop us, they might as well kill us all." After these words were said, the entire road fell silent. A stern and cold atmosphere began to spread among the crowd. They appeared nervous, but the internal court eunuch's heart was calm. Presumably, the officials in the Overwatch Council carriages had already learned of Tiger Guard Gao Da's identity in the shortest amount of time possible. They knew of Gao Da's relationship with their director. Regardless of whether or not they had found out what the court wanted to do with this matter, they would not allow the internal court to capture Gao Da so easily. The problem was the internal court and Ministry of Justice had to capture Gao Da and bring him back to Jingdo before the Overwatch Council sent the information to Fan Xian. They had to use force. The internal court unit believed that no matter how forceful the Overwatch Council was, they would not kill everyone in the mountains of the Qin Kingdom. The eunuch believed that the 30-odd carriages of the Overwatch Council had the power to kill all of them. He believed that if the Overwatch Council did not want to rebel, they would not use such ruthless methods. Thus, he walked coldly and slowly toward Gao Da. The Overwatch Council official turned his body and looked at him coldly out of the corner of his eye. It was as if he was still calculating how to handle the situation before him. If this had been any other time, the official would have long thought of countless sinister ideas that would make the internal court and Ministry of Justice want to eat sh*t. However, he had suddenly encountered Gao Da and suddenly heard that the court was capturing an imperial criminal. In particular, he had discovered the hidden dangers of this matter that could drag the commissioner into it. The official's emotions were agitated. For a moment, he could not come up with a firm idea. No one came down from the carriage. All of the Overwatch Council officials and secret agents, including the 6th Bureau swordsman hidden in the darkness, waited for him to speak. He still did not speak until the internal court eunuch walked to Gao Da's side. Right at this moment, a wave of noise suddenly broke the silence and austere atmosphere outside Dazhou City. A wave of women's laughter and noise suddenly resounded through the night sky. It was just like the stories of fox immortals told in novels. The silent long night suddenly became a paradise for people to take a stroll in. Everyone's ears perked up. They grew nervous. How could there suddenly be so many women in the middle of the night? Immediately after, these people's eyes widened. They had never thought that one day, no, one night, they would see so many beautiful women at the same time. Countless beautiful women in colorful dresses, beautiful as the wind, elegant figures, and all kinds of makeup surged from the back of the carriages toward the sternly scene. They seemed to not know that there was a tense atmosphere in front of them. They continued to excitedly talk about the frustrations of the journey and whose rouge was stained with dust. The road back home seemed to be quite far. After sitting in the carriage for so long, he felt a bit of a need to use the toilet. He wanted to squat in the grass, but none of the wild men in the yard were as tactful as Sir Fan Jr. They didn't even say anything about stopping. With great difficulty, the group of carriages stopped, but no one came to help their hands. This carriage was quite skilled. Everyone looked at this scene dumbfounded. They all felt they had sunk into an unreal environment, particularly the officials of the Ministry of Justice at the very front. Looking at this scene, it was like they had seen a ghost. The old internal court eunuch, who had walked calmly to Gao Da's side, suddenly opened his eyes wide. He abruptly stood up and looked at these beautiful women. He suddenly thought of the garden everyone in Jingdo knew about. Then he saw a pure black wheelchair being carried down from the pure black carriage. An old cripple sat in the wheelchair. His knees were covered with a wool blanket. The old cripple looked at the head eunuch and said in a raspy and slightly sharp voice, "Why have you stopped for so long? It looks like if I don't become the director, my words won't be as effective as that kid's." The internal court ace looked at Chun Pingping like he was looking at a ghost. He could not understand why this old man would suddenly appear outside Dazhou. His knees unconsciously began to tremble. His entire body and mind were taken over by a kind of terror. He knew he had made a huge mistake. He had only thought that if Sir Fan Jr. was not in the carriages, no one in the Overwatch Council would dare to directly challenge the authority the internal court represented. He had not thought that while Sir Fan Jr. was not there, the old director was in the carriages. With a thud, He knelt down and lowered his head deeply. Respectfully, he said, "Greetings, Director." All of the dumbfounded officials, bailiffs, and soldiers immediately guessed the old cripple's identity. The Qing kingdom's decades of sinister power pressed down on them until they didn't dare to move. They knelt straight to the ground, including the Dazhou Zhizhou. There was no exception. On both sides of the road, officials knelt on the ground toward the old cripple beside the carriage. Chun Pingping looked around with a calm expression. Suddenly, he clenched his fist and gently coughed. A strange emotion flashed through his eyes. He muttered to himself, "Yi Zi was right. Qiao Qiao's mother indeed gave birth to Qiao Qiao." 4 days ago, the entire royal palace in Jingdou was enveloped in the faint sunlight of the end of summer and beginning of autumn. It was clear and peaceful. The Qing kingdom was in the midst of a joyous occasion. From the emperor to the peddlers and servants, their bodies all emanated a fresh and enchanting aura from the inside out. The usually sinister royal palace seemed to have changed. The slowly moving spots of light in Taiji Palace all appeared mischievous. The only place that had not changed was the royal study. There was a heating stove in the winter and a basin of ice in the summer. It was like spring all year round. The lack of change was annoying. The master of the royal study, the Qing kingdom's great emperor, was a terrifying figure who had remained the same for decades and had not changed at all. The people of the Ministry of Justice should have arrived in Dazhou. Find time to deal with this matter. The emperor coldly put down his teacup. The great prince had already arrived in Dongyi and had begun to deal with the rebellion in the Liang kingdom. The secret memorials had just been sent back to Jingdou. The emperor only glanced at them briefly and then stopped caring about them. It should not be difficult for his 2 sons to deal with the small matters in Dongyi. Scholar, he has put in a lot of effort. Eunuch Yao looked at his nose and his nose at his heart. He said this very normally. Although his words were normal, the reality was not normal. Although He Zonwei had always wanted to have a good relationship with the heads of the eunuchs in the palace and had invested a great deal of passion and money into it, for some reason, the respect and affection the eunuchs and serving girls had for Fan Xian came from the bottom of their hearts and had never changed. Eunuch Yao's words were, without a doubt, a hidden stab at Scholar He. The Qing emperor's expression did not change. He only laughed slightly and said, "He Zonwei is also afraid of death. However, that person called Gao has already lived for so long. I have given Nji enough face, although he does not seem to know that the traitor is still alive." Eunuch Yao suddenly said in a trembling voice, "The old director will pass by Dazhou in 3 days. Your Majesty, please make a decision." Chapter 687. The mischievous speck of light ran away coolly from under the bright tiles of Taiji Palace. Passing through the heavy wooden doors of the rear palace, it ran into Hongguang Palace, burrowed into Shufeng Palace, circled a few times under the slightly scarred tree, and finally hid in Guangxin Palace, which no one had lived in for a long time. Even in the slightly dry autumn wind, Guangxin Palace continued to emit a faint and bitter coldness. The white curtains in the palace had long become broken and brittle muslin. There were plum blossoms, but no people. They only shone brilliantly. Even when they bloomed to the point of decay, they were still lonely. Compared to the quiet back palace, the imperial city around the front hall did not match the light atmosphere of the imperial palace. Especially inside the green stone imperial city, in the room deep under the vermilion-red palace wall, there was a solemn atmosphere. A few cold-eyed generals stood guard outside the room, but inside the room, it was unknown what they were talking about. I wonder when the great prince will return. General Gong Dian, who had resumed his position as commander of the imperial army and was in charge of the safety of the entire royal palace, stood by the person's side. There are not many people in this world who could make Gong Dian stand so obediently by his side. The person at the table was one of them. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, who had rendered meritorious service during the Jingdou Rebellion and was now appointed by the emperor to control the armies of the world. Commander Yi stroked his teacup with one hand. His eyes appeared slightly serious. He didn't speak for a long time. brother. Perhaps this kind of silence was difficult for Gong Dian to endure. In the end, he couldn't resist reminding him. Oh, Yi Zhong seemed to wake from his thoughts and replied, Director Fan Jr. will be returning to the capital in a few days. If the great prince wants to return, it will be at least the beginning of spring. He glanced at Gong Dian. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. A moment later, he said in a low voice, What exactly do you want to ask? Even if the great prince returns to the capital, presumably he will immediately be transferred to Yanjing by the emperor to prepare for the northern expedition. What exactly do you want to ask? Gong Dian was silent. He and Yi Zhong were both the emperor's trusted aides. However, although the entire royal palace appeared peaceful this afternoon, there was a murderous intent hidden within it that he was not used to. He faintly guessed that this murderous intent had something to do with a major figure who had just left Jingdo not long ago. Otherwise, his senior brother would not have been overseeing matters in the Bureau of Military Affairs. Instead, he calmly waited outside the royal palace for an entire day. What are you waiting for? Asked Gong Dian. I'm waiting for His Majesty's decree. After Yi Zhong said this, he remembered that the emperor was currently making a decision. A trace of anxiety and uneasiness appeared in his eyes. With Yi Chong's status and power, there were few things in the world that could make him feel this way. He closed his eyes slowly, not wanting Gong Dian to see this. However, Gong Dian had already seen it and knew that he had guessed correctly. Inside and outside the royal palace, it appeared peaceful. In reality, undercurrents were surging. The defense level of the entire imperial army had been raised to its most tense state. Gong Dian had only accepted orders from the internal court. He didn't know what the emperor deep in the palace was guarding against. Immediately after, the imperial army received a seal from the Jingdo garrison. Only then did they know that Shi Fei had led 15,000 Jingdo garrison soldiers and spread out in a formation along the south side of Jingdo. It seemed to be a drill, but it also seemed like they were preparing for a major battle. The Bureau of Military Affairs also moved. The internal court also moved. In the streets and alleys of Jingdo, various factions began to prepare. To be able to move so much military power and arrange such a large formation within one day, it could only be the Qing Emperor alone. In the present world, there was only one person who was worthy of the emperor's serious and careful treatment, and who had the power to make the emperor expend so much energy. Only that person could make Yi Zhong, the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, unable to stop his uneasiness and anxiety as he waited for the emperor's final decree. All sorts of situations interweaved together. Gong Dian finally confirmed that the emperor was going to act against Director Chun. Why? Gong Dian's throat was a bit dry. He sat down by Yi Zhong's side and raised his cup of cold tea to drink it in one gulp. However, it did not extinguish the burning fear in his heart. The imperial army protecting the palace, the movement of the garrison, and the Bureau of Military Affairs were, without question, arrangements aimed at the Overwatch Council in Jingdo. Regardless of whether it was the Emperor, Commander Yi Zhong, or Gong Dian, once they thought that the person they were going to deal with was Chun Pingping, none of them had complete confidence. Only these people at the very top of the Qing kingdom knew what kind of power Chun Pingping, this skinny old cripple, had in his hands. Although he was no longer the director of the Overwatch Council, he had been the king in the darkness of the land for decades. Once he was in a dangerous situation, who knew what kind of power he would explode with? What made Gong Dian feel the most terrified, uneasy, and even faintly angry at the emperor was that he could not find any reason why the court wanted to deal with Director Chun. Was it just because his achievements shocked the emperor? This made no sense at all. If he had considered this, perhaps the emperor would have killed Chun Pingping 20 years ago. Did Chun Pingping have disloyalty? Everyone under heaven knew that Director Chun was the most loyal official at the emperor's side. If it weren't for him, the emperor would have died countless times back then. Why? This was the explanation Gong Dian needed to hear the most. He began to feel that the emperor was too muddle-headed. Regardless of what the people thought of the Overwatch Council or Chun Pingping, the Overwatch Council was the emperor's special agency. Chun Pingping had always been the emperor's loyal dog. For the emperor to risk the danger of court chaos to do such an unreasonable thing, if it wasn't muddle-headed, what was it? Yizhong sat by the little table and was silent for a long time without saying a word. Of course, he knew why Gong Dian had lost his composure. Even though he had countless soldiers in his hands, he knew that he was dealing with Chen Pingping and the entire Overwatch Council. In the depths of his heart, he still felt a tremor and fear. Chen Pingping's reputation was too great. The things in his head were not things that normal officials could understand. Decades of history had long proven that anyone who used crafty plots and schemes to deal with Chen Pingping, in the end, would not meet a good end. Xiao En at his peak was one of them. The rebellions of the eldest princess and the old Qin family became a joke under the combined efforts of Director Chen and the emperor. Yizhong took a deep breath. There was a hint of unswerving determination in the darkness of his square face. What you need to do is to protect the safety of the royal palace. What I need to do, without question, is to stabilize the Qin kingdom's army. As for those other things, naturally, someone will do it. You must act. Otherwise, the emperor would not have summoned you here today. Gong Jian glanced at his brother disciple with a face full of worry. He didn't feel good in his heart. Back then, Chen Pingping had been able to place a 20-year spy in the old Qin family. Who knew who in the Yi family, or even the most reliable Dingzhou army, were Chen Pingping's people? The emperor is muddle-headed. Gong Jian thought that if the emperor truly broke off relations with Director Chen, no matter what the final outcome was, the entire Qin court would suffer irreversible damage because of this turmoil. The Overwatch Council might not rebel. Yizhong closed his eyes tightly and faintly said, "The emperor must have his own way of controlling the Overwatch Council." Gong Dian only shook his head. Although in his heart, the emperor was the most powerful person in the world and most worthy of loyalty and worship, Chen Pingping was, without question, the most powerful person hidden in the darkness. The Overwatch Council was not so easy to control. Immediately after, he thought of another terrifying matter. If the old director is truly captured and brought back to Jingdou, Gong Jian stared into Yizhong's eyes and said through gritted teeth, "What will Sir Fan Jr. do? The emperor is muddle-headed." This was the third time he had said the emperor was muddle-headed. As a loyal official, Gong Dian's reaction was indeed a bit big. However, this cannot be blamed on him. Anyone who knew the true movements of the court would feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts. If this operation was targeted at Chen Pingping, it was the same as targeting the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian. Yizhong suddenly opened his eyes and coldly said, "He has probably just left Dongyi. Once the ship has sailed, what can he change? Even if Chen Pingping has the grace of passing on his legacy to him, in the end, this is the emperor's will. As a son, would Fan Xian have the desire to avenge his father because of an old superior?" Gong Jian thought about it carefully and slowly nodded his head. These two important military officials only thought that Fan Xian being able to take control of the Overwatch Council was the emperor's will, and that Chen Pingping had only played the role of passing on help and guidance. They had completely not thought of Fan Xian's feelings for Chen Pingping or the story this matter involved many years ago. "Sure Fei has already brought the Jingdou garrison south," Yizhong slowly said. Yichong spoke slowly. "I only hope that this incident will cause as little commotion as possible." "Impossible." Gong Dian very straightforwardly shattered Commander Ye's fantasies. They were all officials of the Qin kingdom. They all hoped that the Qin kingdom would be able to maintain stability and harmony while the present situation was good. They all hoped that the Qin kingdom could move steadily and powerfully toward its most glorious day. However, everyone knew that the battle between the emperor and Chen Pingping would certainly create a large chasm in this country. "I don't know what His Majesty is thinking." Yi Chong's expression was steely as he said word by word, "I only know that if Your Majesty wants to arrest Director Chen, the director must have done something." Gong Dian shook his head. "I don't think so. If the Qin kingdom's great emperor was like a god in the sunlight, unattainable, dazzling, and ruling over the world, then the Qin kingdom's great emperor was like a god in the sun. Then Chen Pingping, who had controlled the Overwatch Council for decades, was like a king in the darkness. He had always carefully hidden behind the Emperor's light and helped the Emperor complete some things that were inconvenient for him to do. He helped the Qin Kingdom control some things in the darkness. For decades, the Qin court had always advanced in the struggle between the civil official system and the Overwatch Council. Regardless of whether it was the powerful Prime Minister Lin Ruofu or the Hall of Governmental Affairs and Imperial Censorate later, no one could shake Chen Pingping's position in court. No one could decrease the Emperor's imperial favor and trust in Chen Pingping. The officials had long gotten used to this and had already given up hope. They thought that the Emperor and Chen Pingping were an anomaly between ruler and official. Perhaps they would know each other until their hair turned white, and then until they died of old age. It would still be this interweaving of light and darkness. The mutual trust between ruler and official was truly a match made in heaven. That was why Gong Dian was afraid and why Yizhong was worried. They didn't dare to imagine how much terrifying energy would be drawn out once the light and darkness clashed. That energy was probably not something that could be resolved by a large army pressing down on a city. Shi Fei, who knew the inside story and was heading southeast of Jingdou, was the person with the heaviest heart. Like Gong Dian, he could not understand why the Emperor was acting against old Director Chen. The old director had clearly resigned from all his posts and wanted to return to his hometown to retire. Why was the Emperor acting now? Most importantly, why was it him? Shi Fei thought of how he was going to face Chen Pingping. Even though he was flying in the warm autumn wind, he couldn't help but shiver. He would rather face the murderous barbarians of Shi Hu and Shang Shanhu, who used troops like a god in northern Xi, than face the old cripple who only had a few hundred people at his side and a few dozen women. He led 4,000 elite soldiers and had long arrived on a mountain not far from Dazhou. He waited nervously and helplessly for that moment to arrive. Fortunately, the Emperor had never made the edict clear. He didn't need to send out troops now. He hoped he would never have to send out troops. He was waiting for the Emperor to change his mind so that he could protect his own life. From the moment General Shi Fei left the city to capture Director Chen and bring him back to the capital, he already had the self-awareness to exchange his life for it. He sat on his horse and gazed back in the direction of Jingdou. His eyes narrowed slightly. He secretly prayed that the Emperor's final edict would never come. Eunuch Yao stood quietly in the royal study. His trembling words earlier were just his duty as a servant. Like all of the generals, officials, and servants in the Qin Kingdom, he also didn't want to see the Emperor and Director Chen fall out. After Hong Xiong, Eunuch Yao, who had become the Qin court's leader, knew too much inside information. He also thought he knew why the Emperor had suddenly developed such a powerful killing intent toward Director Chen. Thus, he only stood nervously and uneasily to the side, not daring to say anything. The Emperor was still thinking. Earlier, a glimmer of bewilderment had involuntarily risen in his eyes. For him, whose heart was like the sky, this kind of bewilderment was an emotion that hadn't appeared in many years. Perhaps only Chen Pingping, who had accompanied him since he was a child, who had always been loyal to him, who had saved his life many times, opened mountains for the Qin Kingdom, and made countless contributions, could cause him to sink into such emotions. A few thin files were placed on the table in front of him. One was the internal court's investigation into the third prince's strange assassination deep in the palace during the Jingdou Rebellion. Another was the secret investigation into the Hanging Temple matter, particularly the dispute between the true head of the Sixth Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the Shadow, and Sigu Jian in the manner of the master of the city in Dongyi this spring. The third was Fan Xian secretly sending the heavily injured Shadow to Jiangnan. The fourth was the strangeness of the Overwatch Council on the day of the attack on Fan Xian in the valley, as well as the process of when the 2 city guarding crossbows were shipped out of the third workshop of the palace treasury. The fourth investigation file was the thickest, but the things recorded were also the most vague. The internal court and court had secretly investigated for a full 3 years. In front of the Overwatch Council and under Chen Pingping's purposeful concealment, The Qing emperor had only found a hint and no concrete evidence. This file talked about the fire in Huichun Hall in Jingdo and the defection of someone in the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council. The matter pointed straight to the inner palace, the crown prince, the eldest princess, and that stormy night. There was a fifth, sixth, the third prince, the second prince, Changxian, Yunrei. The emperor's face was slightly pale. He picked up a thin file and placed it to the side. Then he would say a name. He threw down 4 files and said 4 names. In the end, he picked up a few files. His fingers tightened slightly as he gently placed them to the side. With a sigh, he said, "This is Ng." The emperor slowly raised his head. The confusion in his eyes had long disappeared. There was only a faint trace of sorrow and a self-mocking, cold smile. "My most loyal official once tried to kill all of my sons. Perhaps it should be said that he forced me to kill my sons." His brows furrowed. "What surprises me the most is that this old dog didn't even let Ng go. If Ng's life had not been strong, he would probably have died to his hands long ago." The Qing emperor slowly shook his head and took a deep breath. A cold light flashed through his eyes. Faintly, he said, "Bring that old dog back. I want to ask him what exactly is going on." Eunuch Yao did not dare to say more. He bowed deeply and walked out of the royal study. His legs were about to give out because he understood the emperor's emotions better than anyone else. The emperor's last faint words were filled with too much unstoppable killing intent. As he was about to leave the royal study, the emperor suddenly said coldly, "Send a message to Yan Bingyun. Tell him I am watching him. Then, send a message to Shi Fei. I want him alive." The emperor's expression remained cold. "If that old dog dies, he doesn't need to come back alive to see me." Chapter 688. There were many things to do this month, so I didn't write much, so I didn't have the nerve to ask for votes. Today was the last day of November, so I had to ask for votes no matter what. I hoped that everyone still had votes. I pursed my lips. Next month, I will do my best to ask for votes. This is quite serious. I will write seriously and ask for votes seriously. Because regardless of whether I can finish writing Qin Use Year next month, one thing is for sure, and that is that I will be asking for votes for the last month. I don't know what the situation will be, so I hope that everyone will leave December's votes for me. Of course, I also want today's votes. I like it very much. Chapter 689. At noon, Scholar he placed a hand on his forehead to block the blinding sun. Ignoring the blinding sweat flowing down his face, he quickly left the quiet royal palace. He did not enter the small corner room of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Instead, he boarded the sedan chair and came to the yamen of the Imperial Censorate. Once he entered the yamen, he realized that his official robes had long been soaked in sweat. Dazed, he walked woodenly into the hall and sat alone for a long time before he came to his senses. Previously, His Majesty had summoned him to the Imperial study. With just a few simple words, He Zhongwei knew that the secret plan he had set up had all fallen into His Majesty's eyes. His Majesty knew what he was investigating, but was too lazy to ask, too lazy to care, and only looked at him coldly. Thinking of this, Scholar He's entire body trembled with fear. After all, his investigation had been somewhat improper. Given the Emperor's intelligent eyes, since he already knew of this matter, how could he not see it? What surprised him was that the Emperor did not harshly reprimand him. He only tiredly gave a few instructions before chasing him out. He Zhongwei sank into deep thought in the cool Imperial Censorate Yamen. Why was the Emperor not angry? Had the Internal Court and Ministry of Justice actually found something in Dazhou? Was it that Tiger Gargauda or Wang Qinian, who was definitely not dead, who had given himself away? Dazhou was not far from Jingdo, but it took time to send information back and forth. He Zhongwei had no other way. He could only wait excitedly and nervously in Jingdo for the report. Until now, he still did not know that his search for Gauda and Dazhou was in line with the will of heaven. It would block the returning director Chen outside the city. At the same time, it would give Chen Pingping an opportunity to act. This was also the emperor's opportunity to act. Not only did he Zonwei not know the inside story of what was happening in Dazhou, who the scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and the Qing officials of the six ministries and three temples also did not guess that the Qing kingdom was in a state of turmoil. They only smelled something strange. No one connected this smell to the retired director Chun. Even the most intelligent person would not think that problems would occur between the emperor and Qin Pingping. Furthermore, the officials did not even think in this direction. Even the officials of the Overwatch Council had never doubted the old ancestors' loyalty to the Qing kingdom and the emperor. Be loyal to the emperor and do everything for the Qing kingdom. This was the education all the officials and secret agents of the Overwatch Council had received when they first entered the academy. During these decades, with Chun Pingping at the head, all of the black-clothed officials had worked endlessly for this goal, for the strength of the Qing kingdom, and for the emperor's safety. Who would have thought that the Overwatch Council would become one of the emperor's targets? It was precisely because no one had thought of this that there were people who were sensitive enough to probe in that direction. As the most powerful intelligence network and secret service organization in the world, many signs of the strange activity in Jingdo had fallen into the eyes of the officials of the Overwatch Council. In particular, the increase in the level of defense of the Imperial Army, the sudden movement of the Jingdo garrison, and even Scholar He's sudden entry into the palace and dejectedly leaving the palace had all fallen into different eyes. Through different channels, they were all sent back to the square, black-gray building. Other than the 5th Bureau, where the Black Knights were, all of the leading figures of the 8 bureaus were in the black-gray building of the Overwatch Council. The sun had just moved to the west when the intelligence reports had been gathered to the 2nd Bureau. After being sorted out by different intelligence officials, they were then placed on the desk of the head of the 2nd Bureau. The head of the 2nd Bureau was a middle-aged man. He was one of the few old officials of the 8 bureaus who had stayed behind. Ever since Fan Xian became the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and gradually began to take over the power of the Overwatch Council. In order to make his takeover smoother, Chun Pingping began to persuade the old officials of the 8 bureaus to leave. These old officials had single-handedly built this council with Director Chun, so they did not have any conflict with the son of the young lady of the Yi family. Thus, they left naturally and happily. Mutai took over the 1st Bureau. Fan Xian's brother-disciple, who used poison, took over the 3rd Bureau. Yan Bingyun took over the 4th Bureau. The commander of the Black Knights had become the silver-masked Jingge. The bald head of the 7th Bureau had left a long time ago. The head of the 8th Bureau was someone Fan Xian had picked from the Qinian unit. Only the 2nd Bureau, because of the importance of intelligence reports, was still managed by the old head. He sincerely and dutifully trained his deputy. Once the deputy was able to take over the entire Qing kingdom's intelligence system, he would have this person close to Director Fan take over. The Overwatch Council and Imperial Censorate had been fighting lawsuits. Director Fan Jr. did not like Scholar He, so He's own way had always been the focus of the Overwatch Council's secret surveillance. Although the Emperor had always been opposed to this kind of surveillance, the court could not keep an eye on the Overwatch Council using the power in their hands to do other things. The middle-aged head of the 2nd Bureau furrowed his brows as he looked at the file in his hand. He didn't know what the Emperor had said to He's own way for his expression to become so ugly. As for the changes in the Imperial Army and the departure of the Jingdo garrison, they were also sensitive intelligence reports. The head of the 2nd Bureau furrowed his brows and thought for a long time. He still could not understand what power there was around Jingdo that the court needed to deal with so carefully. In particular, the Overwatch Council had not participated in this matter from the beginning. The palace had not even given a word. This was truly very different from before. He picked up the file on the table and coughed. He walked out the door and up the stairs to the quiet secret room. He knocked on the door twice and pushed it open to enter. A young official dressed in white, completely at odds with the sinister atmosphere of the Overwatch Council, was sitting behind a large table and looking intently at something. The head of the 2nd Bureau smiled slightly. He looked at Yin Bingyun and sighed in his heart. He then walked forward and placed the file in his hands on the table. The old director had already retired. Sir Fan Jr. had finally become the true director. It was clear that Sir Yin Jr. would not only manage the affairs of the Fourth Bureau. He would probably take over Fan Xian's position as the new commissioner of the Overwatch Council. During these years, Chen Pingping had been recuperating. Fan Xian also did not have the patience to manage the details. Thus, all of the Overwatch Council's affairs had always been shouldered by Yin Bingyun alone. Thus, when Yin Bingyun became the commissioner in charge of the council's miscellaneous matters, the officials of the Overwatch Council were all used to it and would not have any objections. For the old officials of the Overwatch Council, although Sir Fan Jr. was a startling talent, and because of the young lady of the Yi family and Director Chen's relationship, they were all loyal to Fan Xian and had great respect for him. However, there was always a distance to this respect. In comparison, Sir Yin Jr., who had grown up in the Overwatch Council and paid a great price for the council in northern Qi, was, without question, closer. Uncle Liu, what is it that requires you to personally deliver it? Yin Bingyun smiled warmly, completely without the frosty feeling he had in front of Fan Xian. Standing, he invited the head of the Second Bureau to sit. He then casually flipped open the files. The movements of the Imperial Army and Jingdo Garrison only need to be reported to the Internal Court and Bureau of Military Affairs. It doesn't matter if we don't know about it. The head of the Second Bureau looked at Yin Bingyun worriedly. But this does not conform to convention. Such a major matter, there must be a purpose. However, the Overwatch Council still does not know what has happened. Yin Bingyun had already flipped through the intelligence reports. The curve of his lips remained steady. Smiling slightly, he said, "It has not been peaceful in Dongyi recently. There are many aces in those places. Furthermore, the Jianghu people are murderous. Perhaps the palace is worried that, like the Hanging Temple that year, a few more killers have snuck in. It is not a big deal for the Imperial Army to raise the level of defense. It is the Jingdo Garrison." Yin Bingyun shook his head. In a moment, send a message to the Bureau of Military Affairs to ask. The Bureau of Military Affairs can ignore us. The head of the Second Bureau furrowed his brows and said. Furthermore, the problem now is that Shi Fei personally led the troops away. It must have been an edict from the palace. He suddenly thought of something. He remembered that Director Chen's carriages had not left Jingdo for long. Immediately, he smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. What is it? Yin Bingyun's gaze was deep as he glanced at him unintentionally. Nothing. The head of the Second Bureau shook his head and smiled. I'm really getting old. Sometimes it's easy for my mind to run wild. He would never have thought that the palace would act against the old director he respected the most. Thus, he unconsciously put an end to his earlier speculations. Just like Gong Dian and Yi Zhong's confusion and General Shi Fei's unease and fear, no one could have thought of this. Yin Bingyun slowly lowered his head and said, "The council's surveillance of the military has never been a public matter. It is best not to send a message to the Bureau of Military Affairs. What is the usual method? We cannot interfere with the military. Usually, we draft up an intelligence report and send it to the palace for the emperor to look over." The head of the Second Bureau was silent for a moment and then said, "Of course, we have to react faster to unusual movements like today." All right. Yin Bingyun's head remained lowered. Immediately put this intelligence report into a report and send it through the secret tunnel to the royal study. Yes. The head of the Second Bureau unconsciously acknowledged, like a subordinate. He suddenly felt that Yin Bingyun's reaction was strange. He did not raise his head and appeared rude. He was now an official of the same rank as him. He had not truly taken up the position of commissioner, yet. He shook his head again. He had watched Yin Bingyun grow up and knew he was not like this. He just thought there was something wrong with the Yin manner, so he didn't think more about it. Picking up the file, he left. The opportunity for the Overwatch Council to react at the first instant was lost just like that. In front of the Qing Kingdom's powerful state apparatus, if the Overwatch Council as a secret agency did not have any reaction, it might be the best reaction for this country, this court, or even this square black and gray building. The room returned to its unchanging silence for countless years. Yin Bingyun slowly raised his head. If there was someone beside him, they would certainly see the increasing struggle and pain in Sir Yin Jr.'s eyes. Yin Bingyun's hands were clenched tightly under the table and did not loosen for a long time. His thin lips were pressed together tightly, so tightly that there was almost no blood left. He slowly stood up and walked to the side of the window. Lifting the black curtain, he gazed out. With a glance, he saw a corner of the bright yellow royal palace glistening under the clear autumn sunlight. He thought of the first time he entered the Overwatch Council. The old man in the wheelchair had met him in this room. The black cloth on the window seemed to have never been taken down. It was as if the old man was used to the darkness and never saw the sunlight again. Later, the old man left this room and returned to Qin Garden. Fan Xian did not like staying in the Overwatch Council's serious and sinister courtyard every day, so the person who stayed in this room the longest was Yin Bingyun himself. In the past, the heads of the 8 bureaus would report matters to the 2 sides of this long table. Now, there was no one on either side of the long table. In the past, there would always be a wheelchair at the end of the long table. Behind the wheelchair was a patch of shadow. Now, the wheelchair was long gone. Yin Bingyun slowly pulled down the black curtain in his hand and let out a long sigh. The confusion, struggle, and pain in his eyes gradually disappeared. Since he was the second owner of this room, he had to inherit the previous owner's temperament and will. Since he had made up his mind, he could not hesitate. Yin Bingyun was one of the 7 young officials the Qing Emperor had summoned into the palace when he was injecting new blood into the court. These 7 young officials were the new people the Qing Emperor had prepared for the future of the Qing kingdom. Other than Qin Hung, who had died in the rebellion, the other 6 had already begun to shine in the Qing court. Of the 6, the one who had climbed the fastest was He Zhongwei. At such a young age, he was already a traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He also held the position of Imperial Censor of the Left. Yin Bingyun and Cheng Jialin, one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, were, without question, grouped into Fan Xian's faction. However, no one knew how much effort and intimidation the Qing Kingdom's mighty emperor had put into the Overwatch Council's Sir Yin Jr. during that night's conversation. In the emperor's eyes, the most important of the so-called 7 gentlemen were He Zhongwei and Yin Bingyun. Yin Bingyun slowly sat down and spread his palms flat on the table. Gently, he ran his hands over the Overwatch Council's complicated documents and intelligence reports. Then, he gently rang a bell and summoned in his direct subordinates, as well as the members of the Qinian unit he could use. In a quiet voice, he gave out order after order. These orders did not appear to have any connection to each other and did not draw much attention. However, the reinforcement to Dongyi and the exchange with Deng Ziyu in Shiliang Road would take up most of the Overwatch Council's attention during these dozen days. In total, 4 orders easily emptied most of the Jingdo Overwatch Council's power and began to move them to various places in the Qing Kingdom. These movements were not unusual, so they did not draw anyone's attention. However, with this, it would be difficult for the Overwatch Council to gather a powerful killing force in Jingdo again. There are not many people who could do this. Even if Fan Xian did it himself, he probably would not have done it as quickly as Yin Bingyun. In the end, Fan Xian was not someone who could handle detailed matters. He understood the Overwatch Council very well, but he still did not understand it as thoroughly as Yin Bingyun. For such a large Overwatch Council to be able to create such a result by only moving a few points, Sir Yin Jr.'s planning skills were still as powerful as ever. The only thing that could not be moved was the first bureau of the Overwatch Council. The first bureau was responsible for overseeing the governance of Jingdo's officials. Furthermore, the first bureau had been personally managed by Fan Xian. Although Mu Tai had become the head of the first bureau, the officials of the first bureau still felt that their direct superior was the director. Although Yin Bingyun had Fan Xian's orders, he could not use overly bizarre orders to move them out of Jingdo. After Yin Bingyun finished all of this, he took a deep breath. It was as if everything he had just done had almost suffocated him. Everything is for the Qing Kingdom. Yin Bingyun slowly closed his eyes. He couldn't help but think of the conversation he had with his father a long time ago. The corners of his smooth eyes twitched involuntarily. Or is it all for the Overwatch Council? When Eunuch Yao left the royal study and came to the foot of the palace walls to announce the imperial edict to Yi Zhong and Gong Dian, not many people in the royal palace knew of this matter. When Yi Zhong and Gong Dian knelt on the ground and forcefully suppressed the shock and unease in their hearts to receive the edict, Eunuch Yao handed over the emperor's letter and said expressionlessly, "General Shi Fei is waiting for the edict." Yi Zhong stood up and accepted the emperor's letter. It was as if he had accepted Dong Mountain. It was so heavy that he could barely raise his arm. He was one of the few remaining 9th-level aces in the Qin kingdom. Faced with this letter, he still felt that he could not bear the burden. Fortunately, the person who truly needed this letter was Shi Fei, an important official sent by the military from Yanjing. Because he had not been in Jingdou for a long time, he had been sent by the emperor on such a dangerous mission. As the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong couldn't help but feel a wave of sorrow for Shi Fei. At the same time, a chill rose in his heart. The emperor had sent the military from Yanjing to handle this matter, and not the Dingzhou army. Other than the fact that Shi Fei was leading the Jingdou garrison, it had to be said that Yi Zhong had lived in Jingdou for a long time. The emperor was not at ease with his relationship with Chun Pingping. Yi Zhong understood this, but his expression did not change at all. Eunuch Yao left the imperial army camp empty-handed. With his body hunched, he slowly walked deeper into the palace. Like Yi Zhong, many complicated emotions rose and fell in this head eunuch's heart. After serving the palace for a long time, he was used to the conversation between the emperor and old Director Chun that was completely different from that between ruler and official. He knew that in the emperor's heart, old Director Chun was not just a normal official. Thinking of the emperor's angry scene in the royal study, the smile on Eunuch Yao's face involuntarily became bitter. In his opinion, if the emperor truly wanted to punish old Director Chun, then wouldn't it have been more convenient for the emperor to take action in Jingdou when the old director had entered the palace to bid farewell? Why did he have to wait until old Director Chun had already left the capital and was on his way home before taking action? The matter was in Dazhou. The Tiger Guard who had escaped before the battle was in Dazhou. The Ministry of Justice aces that Scholar he had sent were in Dazhou. The aces that the internal court had sent to help the imperial censorate were also in Dazhou. Eunuch Yao understood the emperor's intentions better than anyone. It looked like the emperor was still watching. Eunuch Yao knew that if old Director Chen truly wanted to escape, unless the emperor personally led troops to chase after him, no one would be able to stop that strange old creature. He walked to Taiji Palace and leaned against the side of a pillar, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The eunuchs and serving girls who passed him bowed respectfully and slightly fearfully, and then silently left. Eunuch Yao closed his eyes and enjoyed the early autumn afternoon sunlight. He sighed to himself and said to himself, "Old director, since you've left, don't come back. The emperor also doesn't want you to come back." After the cold-blooded and heartless Qing emperor had secretly investigated for a long time, he still went against his nature and gave Chun Pingping a chance to defend himself and a chance to leave. Before Qin Pingping left, he did not defend himself. Now, outside Dazhou, he had run into Tiger Guard Gouda, who was wanted by the court. It all depended on whether or not he was willing to leave. If Qin Pingping was willing to leave, perhaps this matter would be over. If he was not willing to leave, then he would have to return to Jingdou. This was not the Qing emperor's affection for Chun Pingping. It was probably more of an interrogation, questioning, and quiet questioning of Chun Pingping's heart. The Qing emperor and Chun Pingping had known and accompanied each other for decades. He could accept anyone betraying him because a paranoid emperor never trusted anyone in the world. However, he could not accept Qin Pingping betraying him. He didn't even believe any of the truths he had discovered. When a person lived in this world, they were always afraid of being alone, particularly the person sitting on the throne. Perhaps the Qing emperor himself did not realize that Chun Pingping, this seemingly lonely old cripple, was the only source of warmth in his cold heart that could prove he was a living person. Thus, The emperor was angry and worried. Until the end, he still looked at himself and Chen Pingping's heart with a glimmer of uncertainty. Those closely involved could not see clearly. Perhaps the only person who could see all of this clearly was the head eunuch leaning against a pillar in Taiji Palace and basking in the sun. Eunuch Hong liked to bask in the sun. Eunuch Yao also liked to bask in the sun. Eunuch Ho, who had died to Fan Xian's hand, also liked to bask in the sun. It was probably because these abnormal people hid too many secrets in their hearts. Their eyes were more sinister than anyone else's, allowing them to know too much about the emperor's joys, anger, sorrow, and joy. However, they could not say it or think about it. Thus, they could only allow the sun to shine endlessly on their bodies to prevent the secrets in their bodies from becoming moldy and the icy emotions for frostbite them. Eunuch Yao closed his eyes and slowly breathed. He was not a powerful warrior like Hong Xiang. He also did not have the noble spirit to sacrifice himself for the Qing kingdom's unification of the world. He was just a cautious and careful person. All of his goals were to ensure that he could live on safely. Thus, other than fear, he had no other thoughts regarding the matter between the emperor and old Director Chen. The sun is truly quite good today, Eunuch Dai said with a smile as he walked out from the side of the hall and leaned against him. Eunuch Yao smiled and glanced at his old companion. The two of them had entered the palace together. However, Eunuch Dai's days in the palace had not been as peaceful as his. Eunuch Dai had first been in Lady Shu's palace and had been deeply favored by the emperor. The important matters of passing edicts to officials' manners were all given to him to do. Later, he lost power in one day and did miserably in the palace. It was not until Sir Fan Jr.'s help and his outstanding performance during the palace rebellion that he once again made a name for himself in the palace. All of the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace were afraid of Eunuch Yao. After all, he was the head eunuch closest to the emperor. However, Eunuch Dai did not have the fear that most people had. After all, he was an old acquaintance. Furthermore, Eunuch Dai's power was not small. Behind him was Sir Fan Jr. Eunuch Yao did not reply. He only moved to the side and gave him half of the corridor pillar's position. Eunuch Dai glanced at him. He wanted to say something, but then stopped. Instead, he sighed and said, "When we first entered the palace, we were lazy and sunbathing here. In the end, we were beaten 50 times by Eunuch Hong. Do you still remember?" Of course, Eunuch Yao remembered. Among the young eunuchs of the time, the young marquis had already died. He sighed. He knew what old Dai wanted to ask. Presumably, he had also sensed the strangeness in the royal palace today. However, this matter was too big. In the entire world, probably only 5 people knew about it. Furthermore, Eunuch Dai and Sir Fan Jr. had a good relationship, so this matter had to be hidden from him. Eunuch Yao smiled and narrowed his eyes as he glanced at the sun to his left. Of the companions of the past, in the end, some died and some scattered. How many of them are like you and I who still remember the friendship of being beaten together? We are still alive. As long as we are alive, that is good. Eunuch Dai shook his head. Eunuch Yao suddenly raised his head and gazed toward the end of the long corridor. He saw a young eunuch slowly walking over with his back hunched. He narrowed his eyes and said, "Hong Zhu has been following you recently. How is he?" This child probably suffered a great shock 3 years ago. He's become more and more taciturn. Eunuch Dai clearly liked the clever and taciturn young eunuch. He sighed and said, "Back then, he was also a popular person in the Eastern Palace. Who would have thought that he would end up like this?" Back then, he also served in the royal study. "Being taciturn is also a good thing," Eunuch Yao said calmly. "Back then, you also talked too much." Eunuch Dai smiled self-mockingly and didn't say anything more. 2 days later, in a mountain on the outskirts of Dazhou, the Jingdou garrison, which had just rested for less than a day, received an urgent secret report from the Bureau of Military Affairs in Jingdou. Shi Fei accepted the secret letter and destroyed the wax at the mouth of the letter. He read the contents of the letter word by word. His pupils constricted slightly and then returned to normal. He was not silent for long before he handed the letter to the soldier beside him. "Take this letter well. You are not allowed to show yourself tomorrow." If I die, give this letter to Sir Fan Jr. Thousands of Jingdo garrison riders were waiting in the valley. General Shifei only brought the soldiers beside him to stand under the setting sun and watch the activity in Dazhou not far ahead. The soldier was slightly shocked. He thought that the Yinjing army had never had any connection to Sir Fan Jr. or even the Overwatch Council. Why was this letter so important? Shifei laughed coldly and didn't explain anything. He looked at his subordinates at the bottom of the valley. He had no confidence in his heart. Even didn't know whether or not there were spies planted by the Overwatch Council among the Jingdo garrison soldiers. Although the court had clearly decreed that the Overwatch Council's regulations strictly forbade the Overwatch Council from infiltrating the military, what kind of person was General Shifei? He did not believe this at all. Even a major figure like the old Qin master had fallen to the hands of an Overwatch Council spy. Shifei did not think he was more powerful than Qin Yi. He took a deep breath and said, "Slow down and move closer in the direction of Dazhou." He was afraid that he would fail and die. He was even more afraid that once he died, the Emperor, in order to appease Sir Fan Jr.'s emotions, would put the crime of killing Director Chen on him. Thus, he handed the Emperor's letter to his soldier. If he failed this time, then this letter had to be delivered to Fan Xian's hands. Chapter 690. Dazhou in the night, surrounded by torches, and filled with sparks in the sky and on the ground. Dazhou was not much darker than day. The previous director of the Overwatch Council, the Qin Emperor's most loyal servant and closest official, Chun Pingping, sat in his wheelchair. He looked at the people kneeling on the ground and kowtowing to him on both sides of the road. The expression on his face did not tremble at all. The fine and deep wrinkles did not bloom into the shape of a chrysanthemum. Instead, they coldly spread out. It was like a shocking scene formed on a yellow plain after being washed by rain for thousands of years. His withered and old hands slowly stroked across the wool blanket. This light gray wool blanket was always smooth and comfortable. Each time he stroked it, Chen Pingping always felt that he was stroking something he did not have the good fortune to touch. It did not take long for him to learn from the internal court eunuch what had happened in Dazhou. He also learned who the court criminal being protected by the Overwatch Council subordinates and being treated was. Gouda? Chen Pingping was not familiar with this name, but he was not a stranger either. He knew that it was Fan Xian's trusted bodyguard. He glanced at the blood-covered criminal of the imperial court, and his cold eyes gradually narrowed. The Overwatch Council did not know that Gouda was still alive. Chen Pingping sighed in his heart. He thought to himself that even the leader of the Tiger Guards had been turned by Fan Xian into someone who valued his life. Although Enji usually appeared indifferent and uninteresting in his conduct, unexpectedly, he had such magic in the fine details. Just as Chen Pingping had said to himself earlier, Qiao Qiao's mother had actually given birth to Qiao Qiao. This was not a very coincidental matter. Rather, it was preordained by cause and effect. The events of the past were preordained, and then they landed here. Just like how the convoy of 30 black carriages of the Overwatch Council was passing through Dazhou as normal. Outside Dazhou, they ran into the court's entourage searching for an imperial criminal. The criminal the court was searching for was one of Fan Xian's people. This was not a coincidence, nor was it a chance encounter. Perhaps there was something hidden behind all of this. So he was actually able to find an escaped imperial criminal. How impressive, Chen Pingping said with a slight smile. Chen Pingping coughed twice and said with a smile. Behind him, the old servant who never left his side pushed his wheelchair towards the center of the crowd. As the wheelchair rolled on the official road, it made a heart-palpitating sound. The internal court eunuch He Qigan had a very high status in the palace. However, his personality was sinister, and he had never been liked by the nobles in the palace. So his status was not very important. However, having suffered in the imperial palace for decades, he naturally knew what kind of attitude he should display at this time. He led the 2 eunuchs and the aces from the Ministry of Justice's 13 yamens to disperse the encirclement. He was afraid that Director Chen would think that they were hostile. Ichigan knew what kind of terrifying figure old Director Chen was. He had never hoped that since they had met Director Chen today, if he gave the order, they would still be able to take the imperial court criminal away. Of course, from another perspective, he did not think that the old director, who had already retired, would go against the emperor's decree for such an insignificant court criminal. After all, the old director was the emperor's most loyal subordinate. However, he had overlooked two things. First, Chen Pingping knew that Gao Da was Fan Xian's person. Fan Xian never liked other people coming to deal with his people, even if those so-called other people were people sent by the palace. Second, Chen Pingping was immersed in a complicated emotion. He looked at the unconscious court criminal Gao Da on the ground and thought about things that bystanders could not understand. The Overwatch Council's treatment was very effective. Gao Da finally slowly woke up from the pool of blood. He should not have been able to withstand such heavy injuries. However, in order to protect his wife and child, a few knife wounds had cut deep into his flesh. All of them had been forcefully received by his body and arms. As soon as he woke up, his eyes were pierced by the torches around him. Gao Da's dry lips moved slightly. He then saw the black wheelchair close to him, as well as the important figure in it. He hadn't seen old Director Chen many times, but he knew what kind of person he was, especially after seeing old Director Chen's slightly worried and complicated gaze. The mute woman saw that her husband had woken up and was overjoyed. Holding the child, she half knelt by his side and repeatedly nodded her thanks to the Overwatch Council officials around her. This commoner woman did not know how delicate the current situation was. She also did not know that whether or not to save him was actually just a prelude to the major events to come. It all depended on what Chen Pingping did. Gao Da's expression darkened. He knew that if Chen Pingping kept his life for Sir Fan Jr.'s sake, then he Zhong Wei could use this matter to drag Fan Xian and even Chen Pingping down with him. His finger moved slightly. A ruthless light flashed through his eyes. He bent his finger and tapped it against his temple. He wanted to escape earlier because he was alone with his wife and child. Even when faced with the powerful machinery of the Qin kingdom, he still wanted to stubbornly live on until the day he could no longer live on. However, he wanted to commit suicide now because he knew that if he lived, he would give Chen Pingping, or more accurately, Sir Fan Jr., who Chen Pingping wanted to protect, a difficult problem. Thus, he chose to commit suicide. Chen Pingping watched him take action and did not have any reaction. There was only a glimmer of admiration flashing through his eyes, as well as a knowing smile flashing across his face. With a slap, the Overwatch Council official who had been standing guard by Gao Da's side the entire time easily stopped Gao Da's thought of committing suicide. He gazed at Gao Da and coldly said, "It's not easy to live for another 3 years. You already have a wife and child. Why are you in such a hurry to die?" This voice was very familiar. Gao Da's heart jumped slightly. With great difficulty, he turned his head to look. He did not expect to see a completely unfamiliar face. However, the Overwatch Council official returned to his original tone of voice. Adding to the familiar teasing light in his eyes, Gao Da immediately knew the other party's identity. Gao Da's dry lips moved slightly, but he could not speak. He looked at the Overwatch Council official like he was looking at a ghost. After a long time, he said in a low voice, crying and laughing, "So, you are also alive." The Overwatch Council official smiled slightly and tightened the strips of cloth on his body. Patting his hand, he said, "Who doesn't want to live? With the director here, your life and death is not up to you to decide." Chen Pingping leaned tiredly against the black wheelchair. The Chan garden women on both sides of the carriages had dispersed into the woods to relieve themselves. Fortunately, the shameful voices did not come over. However, the teasing voices gradually grew louder. The old man narrowed his eyes and looked at Gao Da. "You are not Gao Da." Gao Da's heart jumped. He looked at Director Chen with confusion. Chen Pingping slowly said, "You are only a minor figure. Your life and death is not a major matter, so it is best if you are alive." After these words were said, not only Gao Da and the Overwatch Council official beside him, but even the Ministry of Justice aces scattered around, as well as Ichi Gan and the other 3 internal court eunuchs, sensed something strange. Tiger Guard Gouda, who had escaped in the face of battle, was a court criminal that scholar he had been secretly searching for a long time. In the eyes of the Overwatch Council, or, more accurately, in Chun Pingping's eyes, he was just an unremarkable minor figure. Ichigan silently took 2 steps back. The Dajo Jijo nervously moved over with small steps and bowed solemnly to Chun Pingping. He then invited the old director into the city to rest. The Overwatch Council was a secret service organization. It was the organization that all officials feared and hated the most. It was also the organization they wanted to establish a relationship with the most. From Chun Pingping to Fan Xian, these 2 people were powerful people who did not need to build relationships in court. Thus, the civil officials of the Qin Kingdom never found any opportunities. Without question, this was a great opportunity for the Dajo Jijo to curry favor with old Director Chun and continue to curry favor with the Duke. As an official, he did not want to pass up this opportunity, no matter what. As for the court criminal, that was the business of the internal court and Ministry of Justice officials. It had nothing to do with him. Chun Pingping paid no attention to this official. He only looked coldly at Gouda, thinking about his own matters. Just as he said earlier, Chun Pingping did not think that Gouda's sudden appearance was a coincidence. He Zhongwei's secret investigation of Gouda and Wang Qinian could perhaps be hidden from the Overwatch Council, but could not be hidden from the Emperor. Why did the Emperor choose to have this matter explode on his way back? It was for a reason, an excuse, and an inquiry. The Emperor was far away in Jingdo, separated by thousands of li, and was questioning Chun Pingping. He was using the matter of the court criminal's life to question Chun Pingping. Were you my black dog or a powerful official with your own will? Powerful officials never had good endings. Even someone like Lin Ruofu, who had seen the opportunity and retreated cleanly and completely hid in Wuzhou to be a farmer, still had to be afraid at all times that the Emperor would be unhappy one day. Chun Pingping was not a normal official. He did not need to worry about these things. He knew the Emperor only wanted to ask him a question and then see his attitude toward the Emperor. Chun Pingping suddenly smiled. His smile was slightly strange. Under the blowing of the night wind and the illumination of the torches, it was like the endlessly blooming golden chrysanthemums under the hanging temple, unafraid of the cold wind and ignoring the mundane world as they bloomed in full bloom. "Let Gouda recover," he said with a slight smile as he gently stroked the arms of the wheelchair. The dozens of people the court had sent from Jingdo to capture the criminal, as well as the hundreds of bailiffs and soldiers from Dajo, heard these light words and felt a chill in their hearts at the same time. They knew Director Chun had decided to interfere, although they did not dare to resist and were powerless to resist the Overwatch Council swordsmen and secret agents in the 30 black carriages, as well as the power hidden in the darkness. They still felt shocked. If Chun Pingping wanted to protect this person, the Emperor would probably have to give him this face. Ichigan and the aces of the 13 Yamens all thought this. Their expressions were very ugly and awkward. However, not a single person dared to express any opposition to Chun Pingping's words. Opposition was ineffective. Opposition was useless. Ichigan's throat was dry. He was not satisfied. He had been sent by the internal court to Scholar He's side and wandered through Qin Kingdom's Chaojun for a year. He was about to capture Gouda, but in an instant, Ichigan thought helplessly that even if he failed this mission, after he returned to the capital, as long as he told the main official and the head eunuch that it was Director Chun who had interfered, what did it have to do with him? The sweet and witty Chun garden beauties finally returned. They opened their eyes wide and looked curiously at the people surrounded by torches. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know what their master was saying or thinking, but they were not worried. Regardless of whether it was in Chun Garden, during the guerrilla warfare during the Jingdo Rebellion, or now on the road back home, they always had people from the Overwatch Council at their side to protect them. Regardless of which department the officials were, they were all very polite to them. They were all orphan girls Chun Pingping had bought from poor people. Other than being beautiful and able to sing good songs, they had no other strengths. However, Chun Pingping was willing to raise them and protect them. This kind of eccentricity also created these flowers in a greenhouse. If Chun Pingping, this large mountain, fell, no one knew what kind of fate these flowers in a greenhouse would meet. Chun Pingping lowered his head and listened to the familiar women's voices not far behind him. He smiled slightly. He did not have the group of carriages follow the Dazhou Zhizhou's invitation into the city to spend the night. Instead, he sat calmly in his wheelchair and looked at the complicated expressions of the internal court eunuchs and Ministry of Justice officials around him. It was as if he was thinking about something and waiting for something. Then he closed his eyes. There were not many people in this world who understood the Qing Emperor as well as Chun Pingping did. Gouda was indeed a minor figure. Even as a touchstone, he did not have that kind of hardness. However, the human heart was always a subjective thing. It was as if the emperor was saying to Chun Pingping in the dark mountains, "This criminal is the stone I left for you." There were many choices placed in front of Chun Pingping. He could save Gouda and then leisurely return home. Although he knew that some people would immediately come before him, just as Yizhong and eunuch Yao thought, in the mountains of the Qing kingdom. Who could stop Chun Pingping? He could ignore Gao Da's life and death and take the women in the carriages back home to retire and live out the rest of his life. The emperor gave Chun Pingping one last chance to choose. Regardless of which one Chun Pingping chose, perhaps it was something the emperor wanted to see. The emperor knew that if Chun Pingping did not want to return to Jingdou to face him again, then no one could force him to return to Jingdou to face him. Chun Pingping did not move. The atmosphere on the two sides of the road became more and more strange. Many people could already see that Chun Pingping seemed to be waiting for something. Was someone else coming? The Overwatch Council official who had been standing guard by Gao Da's side walked to the side of the wheelchair and lowered his body to quietly say something by Chun Pingping's ear. Chun Pingping slowly shook his head. He shook his head slowly but firmly. Before long, voices gradually rang out from the back of the road. These voices were not very noisy. On the contrary, they carried a cautious tone. The Overwatch Council officials did not stop this group. Instead, they cautiously used their gazes to escort them to the center of the circle of torches. The Dazhou Zhizhou, Hichigan, and the other internal court eunuchs and officials of the Ministry of Justice finally saw this group clearly. They finally knew who Director Chun was waiting for. Other than shock, they couldn't help but feel a chill. Director Chun had long known what was going to happen. If this was a large chessboard, then Hichigan, the internal court eunuchs, the officials of the Ministry of Justice who had worked hard for a long time, and even Hizongwei, who had laid out this plan in the beginning, were all unremarkable chess pieces on the chessboard. The people Hizongwei had sent did not have an imperial edict in their hands. The Overwatch Council's interference could not be considered disobeying the edict. Given Chun Pingping's position, there was no problem. However, the imperial edict had finally arrived. It was like a red team suddenly jumping a horse onto the back of an elephant and then asking the old black general, "Do you want to move or kill the horse?" There were no eunuchs announcing the edict in the small group of a dozen or so people. These Qing soldiers wore armor and were unusually valiant. However, they all wore complicated emotions on their faces. The leader of the small group held the bright yellow imperial edict high in his hand. The sound of horse hooves broke the silence outside Dazhou. All of the soldiers dismounted in unison and bowed solemnly toward Chun Pingping in the wheelchair. The leader of the small group, holding the imperial edict, began to read the emperor's edict in a trembling voice. The edict had nothing to do with Chun Pingping, who had returned to his hometown to retire. It was only directed at the court criminal Gouda in the Overwatch Council carriage. It ordered the Ministry of Justice to immediately bring this traitor who deceived the emperor back to the capital. No one was to stop him. Otherwise, he would be punished with treason. After the reading of the edict, it was so quiet that one could hear the sound of water dripping from the grass not far away. Everyone's gaze turned fearfully toward the old man in the wheelchair. Even the stupidest person could see that something was wrong. How could there be such a coincidence in the world? Just now, the Overwatch Council had said that the internal court did not have an imperial edict. Now, The imperial edict had appeared in Dazhou. The Dazhou Zhizhou unconsciously took a step back. Everyone unconsciously took a step back. They finally knew that this scene was actually a game between the emperor and Director Chun. They did not have the right to participate in this matter. They didn't even have the right to take a look. The leader finished reading the imperial edict in a trembling voice and put the bright yellow cloth back into his clothes. He then walked to the front of the wheelchair and knelt down on one knee. In a low voice, he said, "I am the Deputy General of the Jingdo Garrison, Guanxiong. Following General Shi's orders, I have come to assist the Ministry of Justice of the Internal Court in capturing the court criminal. Please make things easier for me, old director." Chen Pingping's face was slightly pale. He knew that this scene would eventually come. In the end, the emperor had not completely blocked off the final path. However, perhaps that was because the emperor had long known that he would block off this path himself. It was still the same old saying. This matter had arisen because of Gouda, but it had nothing to do with him. It was just a mutual question between him and the emperor. In the distant mountains, it was all quiet. All of the horses were chewing. The Qin Kingdom's war horses had been trained very well. They didn't even make a sound when they stepped on the ground. Thousands of elite riders of the Jingdo garrison were waiting in this valley, waiting for the final order to launch the attack. Thousands of armored riders charging toward the 30 black carriages on the road should not be a difficult mission. Regardless of whether it was General Shi Fei standing at the very front or the Jingdo garrison soldiers behind him who already knew the inside story, they all felt that this was perhaps the most difficult battle of their lives. Shi Fei sat quietly on the back of his horse and put down the telescope in his hand. He did not forget that the Qin Kingdom only produced a few pairs of this telescope. The one in his hand was a gift from Sir Fan Jr. during the New Year. Shi Fei had experienced countless battles in his life. He could truly be said to be someone who had been through hundreds of battles. 3 years ago, the Dongshan Road in the capital was in chaos. The commander of the Northern Expedition Camp, Yin Xiaoi, rebelled and led thousands of soldiers to surround the Great Dong Mountain. The entire Northern Expedition Camp sank into chaos. Although the rebellion failed and the Northern Expedition Camp was like a group of dragons without a leader, it was very likely that a mutiny or defeat would occur. At that time, Shi Fei received the emperor's important orders and entered the Northern Expedition Camp alone. With an imperial edict, he subdued tens of thousands of soldiers. It was because of this great service that he became the present commander of the Jingdo garrison. One person could subdue tens of thousands of people. Now, thousands of people were going to deal with an old man in a wheelchair who could not move easily. Shi Fei was still very nervous. The group announcing the edict had already left. Shi Fei prayed in his heart that Director Chun would retreat in front of the imperial edict. For some reason, he knew that Chen Pingping would not retreat, not even by a single step. This was a very strange feeling. Perhaps the emperor knew that Chen Pingping did not want to retreat, so he had left a path of retreat for him. He didn't know what had happened between the emperor and Director Chun, but he knew that it must have been deeply entangled between the two of them. Even though Director Chun was about to retire, it forced the two of them to choose to fight face to face. The road illuminated by the torches seemed to sink into a kind of silence. Then, Chen Pingping seemed to slowly shake his head again. Shi Fei took a deep breath. The cold wind in the valley entered his lungs and made him feel a bit cold. He slowly pulled down the mask on his face and said in a heavy voice, "Get ready." Thousands of armored soldiers began to prepare to surround the former director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping. "The emperor wants me to go back and ask me some things." Chen Pingping sat in the wheelchair and said with a smile, "This is something I have long thought of, but I didn't expect that he would wait until now to ask about it. I also didn't expect that after asking about it, so many things would happen." He shook his head and sighed. "The emperor still doesn't understand me well enough." The Overwatch Council official suddenly knelt down by his side and gritted his teeth. "You must follow the edict." "No, I've been following edicts my entire life. Now that I'm going to die, what more should I follow?" Chen Pingping smiled. "The emperor wants to ask me some things. How could I not want to ask him some things face to face?" Then, His face became cold, and his gaze became icy. Looking at the hundreds of people illuminated by the torches, he said in an icy voice, "In one's life, there are always some questions that have been lingering in one's mind for a long time that must be asked." With these words, the sound of hooves thundered outside Dazhou. The shadows of armor reflected the moon. In an instant, it suppressed the light of the torches. A patch of dust rose in the dark night behind the road. In just a few breaths, it had come near the line of carriages. Thousands of armored soldiers spread out silently and fiercely. Everyone's faces turned deathly pale as they stared blankly at this scene. As for the delicate women in the caravan, they couldn't help but scream in fright when they saw this scene. Chen Pingping's expression did not change as he sat in his wheelchair. However, a mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. He didn't speak. None of the Overwatch Council subordinates acted. They only gripped the handles of the metal rods tightly. Their fingers curled around the rings of the crossbows as they stared nervously at the riders charging toward them from the fields on either side of the road. What was different from normal battles was that the thousands of riders did not use this momentum to charge directly into the carriages and begin a slaughter. Instead, they willingly gave up the advantage of the riders' momentum and slowed down at the last moment. They only formed into 3 sharp points and surrounded the 30 carriages. Thousands of armored cavalrymen marched on the black official road, under the red torches and under the silver moon, forming a terrifying scene. It was a murderous scene. The old servant pushed his wheelchair and slowly turned around. Chen Pingping rested his chin on the armrest and looked at the general hidden from head to toe in armor in the fields beside the road. Smiling slightly, he said, "You want to capture me with just 3,600 people? General Sure, are you looking down on me too much?" Riding on his horse, Sure's face struggled in his heart. He didn't give his subordinates an immediate order to charge because he hoped the situation could still take a turn for the better. He was not willing to completely fall out with the Overwatch Council like this. He didn't know what Chen Pingping had up his sleeves and didn't care about them. He had to consider what kind of wretched fate awaited him in the future if he was loyal to the Emperor and became a mortal enemy of the Overwatch Council. He was afraid of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian, but he was even more afraid of the Emperor. That was why he had come today, but still hadn't taken action. Hearing Director Chen's words, his body on the horse trembled slightly. In a raspy and pained voice, he said, "Director, if you resist the edict and take in an imperial criminal, I will have no choice but to—" Before he could finish, Chen Pingping had already frowned and smiled. As expected, it's always a problem of officials disobeying the imperial edict, and not a problem of the monarch sending troops to ambush an old official who has returned home. He sighed and said, "Our Majesty, even at such a time, has not forgotten to maintain his grand and righteous image. Naturally, a shady character like me naturally has to play my role well." Out of the 30 carriages, other than the carriages carrying luggage and women, the Overwatch Council escorts totaled less than 100 people. However, it was these 100 Overwatch Council officials who faced the Jingdo garrison's 3,000 riders that did not show any signs of retreat. Their expressions were as cold as always. Shifei watched this scene quietly and sighed his heart. The Overwatch Council only had eyes for Director Chun. Where was the Emperor? Faced with the Emperor's edict, these Overwatch Council officials only knew to protect the Director's safety. They didn't even need to think about it. No wonder the Emperor was so afraid of this matter. Shadows swayed faintly in the woods on either side of the road. No one knew how many assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council were inside. Shifei suddenly felt a glimmer of coldness. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and leaned against the wheelchair. It was as if he was about to fall asleep in the night wind. Regarding the matter of naming the children, thank you for everyone's trust. Many readers have made similar requests, but I have never dared to accept them because I know my standards are very poor. Thinking of Pingping, Suaso Dien Dien, Duo Duo, Cici Ruo Do Do. Does anyone still dare to let me name them? I scratch my head. In the past, I had given a few names to my friends' children, such as Yiwen and Yusu. Other than the latter, the first few were all cursed, particularly after the children grew up. Chapter 691. Fei stared in a daze at the old man in the wheelchair. After a moment of silence, he slowly pulled up the visor on his face, revealing a determined and cold face. He was, after all, an important official in the Qing military. Ever since he had taken over as commander of the Jingdo garrison, he knew that his life was no longer just bitterly holding on under Shang Shanhu's pressure on the North Road. He had to actively or passively choose something. Before the emperor's imperial edict, he had no choice. He could only come to Dazhou and surround Chun Pingping's group of carriages returning home. Since he had already been surrounded and had already taken action, there was no possibility of stopping. The war horses were in the fields, gently and uneasily stepping on the early autumn plants. They were ready to charge at any moment. Fei slowly raised his right hand. The 3,000 armored riders in the fields began to slowly change their formation and pressed closer toward the carriages on the road. It startled the women in the carriages into another soft cry. Oh! A clear and sharp whistle rang out from the black carriages. No one knew which Overwatch Council official in charge of Qin Pingping was the first to give the order under the threat of the Qing riders. Ho! Ho! After the 12 shouts, countless black crossbows stretched out from the carriages. Countless strong bows were hidden under the shafts, behind the horses, and beside the carriages. At the same time, countless Overwatch Council assassins began to completely hide their traces in the dark mountain forests. After the first cry rang out on both sides of the road, countless clear and cold whistles rang out from the carriages made up of 30 black carriages. Immediately following, it was a series of closely packed sounds of springs and the clashing of metal. There was the wretched sound of bowstrings snapping, the muffled sound of crossbows tightening, and the grinding sound of metal rods being unsheathed. Countless heart-palpitating sounds quickly spread out in the long line of carriages in the shape of a wave, in accordance with an extremely well-practiced and tacit order. The tips of the crossbows all shone with a frightening blue light. The poison abilities of the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council were, without question, the most powerful in the world. Fei, who had just slowly lowered his right arm, looked at this scene. His pupils rapidly constricted. He knew how terrifying the Overwatch Council was, but he had not thought that there would be so many crossbowmen hidden in a mere 30 black carriages, as well as those travelers in the night. Fei knew this was an order from the Overwatch Council. Once the word, ho, ended and someone gave the order, the poisoned arrows would shoot viciously toward the 3,000 riders under him. Even if the main cavalry could break through the Overwatch Council's defensive ring of carriages, how many people would die? After those poison metals were inserted into the bodies of the boys, how many of them could survive? Fei narrowed his eyes, as if trying to hide the coldness in his heart and the narrowing of his pupils. His body and mind seemed to have been shaken by the cold and emotionless voices earlier. He rode his horse and stood closest to the road. He could clearly see that a few hemp-clothed swordsmen were already standing in front of Director Chen. Director Chen still had his head slightly lowered. It was as if he was not afraid of the thousands of riders that were about to arrive. The sound of the hooves was like thunder. At this moment, the two sides were very close. The sound of thunder rang in their ears. The Dazhou bailiffs and soldiers on the road had long shrunk to the back in fear. The internal court eunuchs led by Hichigan and the aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice also had pale faces. They had never thought that the task of capturing a court criminal would become the court's most secretive operation. The only person whose expression did not change was Chun Pingping in his wheelchair, the hemp-clothed men by his side, the old servant behind him, the Overwatch Council officials on the carriage holding crossbows, bows, and metal rods. In other words, the officials of the Overwatch Council had nerves of steel that normal people did not have. Faced with the metal riders that seemed to cover the mountains and plains charging toward them, not even their eyelashes trembled. Not even the fingers gripping the crossbows trembled. They were not afraid or nervous. They only waited coldly for the last order, The order to launch a counterattack after the 12th weight was said. Shi Fei's hand gripped the scabbard at his waist tightly. He narrowed his eyes and stared closely at Chun Pingping, who was not far in front of him. He felt that his surroundings had become strange because of the Overwatch Council's silence and coldness. The Jingdo garrison riders scattered around the road were not far. Why did it seem like they had charged for a long time and still had not charged over? This feeling was too strange. Shi Fei blinked and found that his eyes were a bit sore. His nervousness gave him the illusion that his right arm had just sunken while the riders were just beginning to pick up speed. Shi Fei rode alone at the very front. He didn't know when the Overwatch Council people would begin to attack him. Even if the Jingdo garrison riders could actually break through the line of defense formed by these cold Overwatch Council officials, he still did not feel any joy. He did not want to see this scene happen because he had no control over what might happen after this charge, such as the knife that could stretch out from behind him at any moment. Chun Pingping waved his hand at Shi Fei from his wheelchair. He did not look like an old man being chased and attacked. Instead, he looked like an elder who had something to tell him. Shi Fei's face showed a struggling expression. Suddenly, he squeezed the horse's belly and cried out, "Retreat!" This cry rang out like thunder on both sides of the road. As an important official in the military, General Shi Fei's personal cultivation was indeed very powerful. His voice quickly traveled into the field of riders that were already very close to each other. Military orders were like mountains. Following Shi Fei's explosive cry, all of the generals and vanguards gave a muffled grunt and forcefully pulled the horses that had already reached their top speed to a stop. Countless pairs of metal hands viciously pulled back on the tough reins. Even the old, calloused hands were pulled until blood came out. Finally, the wildly charging Iron Riders stopped less than a dozen feet from the road. However, there were still a dozen riders who were unable to steady themselves. The horses gave two muffled grunts. Their legs gave way, and they crashed directly into the stone walls on both sides of the road. Limbs broke and blood flowed. There was the sound of hurried breathing and nervous gazes met. General Shi Fei roared. The 3,000 Iron Riders suddenly stopped. This person's skill at controlling soldiers was indeed first-rate in the world. However, with this, the Iron Riders lost their advantage in speed. The two sides were also very close. The Jingdo garrison riders were completely exposed to the Overwatch Council's arrows. It was like they had taken off the clothes of a virgin and were standing naked in front of countless lechers. After the Ho words, all of the Overwatch Council's subordinates had been waiting calmly. Even though the invading riders had suddenly made such a big mistake and given the Overwatch Council such a good opportunity, they still did not take the initiative to act. Instead, they only watched coldly at the densely packed riders. Shi Fei breathed heavily a few times. The armor on his chest rose and fell slightly. There was no cold sweat on his body. Since he had chosen to take the risk, he would not regret his choice. A moment later, he coldly urged his horse forward. Under the watchful gazes of the Overwatch Council officials and the aim of the dark arrows, he opened up a path and trotted toward Chun Pingping. The horse stopped not far in front of the wheelchair. Shi Fei maintained his respect and dismounted. The weight of the armor on his body made his footsteps appear heavy. In the quiet night, they made a muffled humming sound. Chun Pingping looked at this brave general and smiled slightly. Revealing an expression of admiration, he said, "With outstanding young people like you in the future of the Qin Kingdom, there should not be any problems. Since it is so, I do not want to kill you." Shi Fei was silent for a long time. He then knelt on one knee in front of Chun Pingping's wheelchair. Taking off the helmet and holding it to his chest, he said, I beg the old director to follow the edict." "Follow which edict?" Chun Pingping looked at him calmly and admired his decisiveness from the bottom of his heart. Earlier, Lao Wang had also told him to follow the edict. However, he smiled slightly and said, "I am taking Gaudo with me. As for following the edict, you know that the emperor has never thought I would follow the edict. If you advise me to follow the edict now, I'm afraid that the emperor will not be happy if he finds out." Shi Fei did not reply to this question. Standing up, he said, "The garrison is the Qing Kingdom's garrison, and the Overwatch Council is the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council. I don't want either side to suffer any losses." Chen Pingping glanced at him with slight mockery and said, 3,640 elite riders of the Jingdo garrison have pursued you for thousands of li. Do you think it is as simple as following the edict or not? Of course, this matter was not as simple as obeying or not obeying the edict. Shifei was only expressing his attitude in front of the Overwatch Council and Dajo officials. After hearing the number 3,640, his heart couldn't help but grow cold. He knew that the fear he had hidden in the depths of his heart was real. If he had not taken the risk to stop the charge of the riders earlier, perhaps the first person to fall right now would have been him. There were people from the old director in the Jingdo garrison. This was what Shifei was most afraid of. The emperor has given a strict edict that the criminal Gao must be brought back to the capital. Shifei took a deep breath and swallowed away all of his unease. Looking at Chen Pingping, he coldly said, "Even if you want to defy the edict, I must still bring him back. I will follow you back to the capital," Chen Pingping slowly said as he closed his eyes. Shifei was shocked. Standing in front of Chen Pingping, he didn't know what to say. The helmet in his arms felt very heavy. At the same time, the Overwatch Council official by Chen Pingping's side also paled in shock. Even the most powerful hemp-clothed swordsman of the 6th Bureau by his side revealed shocked expressions. "Director, you cannot return to the capital," the Overwatch Council official who called himself the deputy head of the 2nd Bureau suddenly said angrily. Chen Pingping slowly opened his eyes. He knew that only the old servant behind him would not be surprised by this decision. He smiled slightly at Shifei and said, "Why didn't you charge over earlier? Presumably, you know that it is impossible for you to control everything here with just 3,000 riders. In reality, the only one who can control all of this is me. If I want to go with you, you can only take me with you." The face of the Overwatch Council official beside him suddenly froze. It was like his face had been smeared with a strange layer of makeup. However, there was a glimmer of terror and unease in this stiffness. Chen Pingping ignored the shock displayed by his loyal subordinates. He only looked coldly at Shifei and said, "Since the situation is under my control, I should be the one to decide what to do." Shifei looked at him in a daze. His fingers unconsciously gripped the air hole in his helmet tightly. In a raspy voice, he said, "If the director follows me back to the capital, please give your orders." Asking the director to follow the edict was a lie. Of course, Shifei knew that the emperor's intention was to capture old director Chen alive and bring him back to the capital. However, this was originally an impossible task. Yet, right now, it seemed that it was about to become real. "I brought 30 carriages worth of luggage and women." Chen Pingping looked at Shifei with a slight smile. "I know what the emperor's edict is, so you don't need to hide anything from me. What I want you to do now is to pretend you never saw these luggage and women." Shifei's breathing became heavy. A glimmer of blood rose to his eyes. "You know the emperor's edict?" Chen Pingping smiled warmly. "I know better than anyone what kind of person the emperor is. If I don't completely destroy what I care about, how could he be happy?" The gaze of the old man in the wheelchair was very deep. Slowly, he said, "My life should have ended a long time ago, but those luggage would not be damaged. Those women are as youthful as flowers." He sighed and said, "If I didn't have to send them out of Jingdo, why would I have to leave Jingdo and accompany the emperor in such a big circle?" Shifei's throat was very dry. He stared at Chen Pingping in a daze. Only now did he know that everything that had happened in Dajo, although it was not completely under the old director's control, was still within his calculations. He had long known that the emperor would send him after him. He also knew how cold and heartless the emperor's edict was. Other than Chen Pingping, no one there would be left alive. However, Chen Pingping had used this to gather everyone he wanted to protect in one spot in Dajo. Then, he easily controlled the situation and forced Shifei to silently accept this reality. He used Chen Pingping's return to the capital alone in exchange for everyone's safety. The question was, Could Qin Pingping easily control the situation? There would always be a limit to the arrows in the 30 carriages. There would always be a limit to the number of swordsmen in the darkness. With 3,600 Jingdo garrison soldiers charging toward them, how long could the Overwatch Council actually hold out? Shi Fei narrowed his eyes. He remembered the Emperor's secret edict clearly. Other than Qin Pingping, leave no one alive. Leave no one alive. Presumably, the Emperor wants to leave no one alive. Qin Pingping looked at him with faint mockery. I pity the people of the Qin Kingdom and these soldiers of the garrison. That's why I'm giving you a chance. Otherwise, I could also leave no one alive. Shi Fei didn't believe these words. He looked at Qin Pingping calmly. He had to make a choice between this terrifying figure and the Emperor's strict edict. He had to capture Gouda and bring him back. The people here had to die. Perhaps he didn't understand. From the beginning of his fear, and when he handed the secret edict to the soldier, he didn't have the courage to hope that he could actually kill all of the Overwatch Council people. What helped Shi Fei make his choice was a black line that suddenly appeared on the surrounding hills. These black lines floated up from each hill, under the silver moonlight. It was as if someone had used a very black charcoal pencil to thicken these unremarkable mountain valley lines. These black lines were made up of people. To be more precise, they were made up of a black cavalryman and another black cavalryman. Countless black cavalrymen stood on top of the mountain, forming these black lines. The Black Knights. A faint smile rose to the lips of the Overwatch Council officials in the carriages, who had been vigilantly watching the riders in the fields and holding crossbows tightly in their hands. They did not know that Director Chun had already made a shocking decision. They only looked at the seemingly endless number of Black Knights on the mountain and once again confirmed that in the mountains and fields of the Qin Kingdom, the Overwatch Council was always invincible. Contrary to the emotions of the Overwatch Council officials, when the black lines appeared on the hill and gradually became clear under the silver moonlight, illuminating the black armor that seemed to carry the will of the netherworld, the Jingdo garrison riders who had come to kill the Overwatch Council all sank into a state of terror and despair. It was not they who had surrounded the Overwatch Council. Rather, it was the Overwatch Council who had surrounded them. What had surrounded them was the Overwatch Council's most powerful martial force, the most powerful riders in the world, the Black Knights. There was a death-like silence. Shi Fei slowly withdrew his gaze from the Black Knights. The Black Knights were still some distance away, but he knew their power. If the Black Knights charged down like this, none of the riders of the Jingdo garrison would be able to survive. What made Shi Fei feel even more angry and shocked was that the Overwatch Council's powerful Black Knights had always been strictly limited by the court to less than 1,000 people. Yet, there were clearly more than 4,000 black-armored riders on the hill. He abruptly turned his head and stared at Qin Pingping. You knew long ago that the Emperor would order me to ambush in Dezhou. No, I never had to calculate such things. I only knew that the Emperor could not bear for me to leave. Qin Pingping looked at him coldly. Now you can think about my conditions. Shi Fei's body began to tremble in anger. The court strictly ordered that the Black Knights should not exceed 1,000. This is treason. Qin Pingping looked at him calmly and said, So what? Shi Fei's confidence was completely destroyed by these words. He stood in front of the wheelchair as if he had lost something. A moment later, he said in a raspy voice, If the Emperor doesn't personally act, no one in this world can keep you here. Why didn't you leave? Why did you wait for me to appear? Because I never wanted to leave. Qin Pingping looked at him calmly and slowly said, I just came to see someone off. Shi Fei returned to his subordinates. The riders of the Jingdo garrison did not set up camp. They just stood there tiredly and helplessly. A feeling of defeat and helplessness enveloped the thousands of riders. As the pride of the Qin Kingdom, the elite riders of the Jingdo garrison had followed the Overwatch Council carriages for a number of days. It was not until this moment that they realized that in the eyes of the old man in the wheelchair, their thousands of seemingly powerful riders were nothing more than a joke. Shi Fei closed his eyes to rest. He had long agreed to all of Qin Pingping's conditions. In such a situation, He had no choice but to agree. However, he still did not understand why someone as meticulous as Director Chun, who had clearly arranged for the Black Knights to come and receive him, would be willing to follow the Jingdo garrison back to the capital. All of His Majesty's thoughts had fallen into Director Chin's speculations and plans. Shifei closed his eyes. His respect for Director Chun had reached another level. He knew that the only person who could control everything in the training hall was indeed Director Chun, and it would never be him. There was already a large, empty space in front of the black carriages. Dozens of Overwatch Council officials were kneeling in front of the black wheelchair and furiously kowtowing, begging the old man in the wheelchair not to follow the Jingdo garrison back to the capital. At this moment, all of the Overwatch Council officials knew exactly what the Emperor was thinking. If Director Chun truly returned to Jingdo, there would be no way out. When the Overwatch Council officials first entered the academy, they were taught to be loyal to the Qing Kingdom and the Emperor. However, the Overwatch Council subordinates who had escorted Chun Pingping back to the capital were the ones who had followed him the longest. Although they were still loyal to the Qing Kingdom and the Emperor in the depths of their hearts, when Chun Pingping's life was seriously threatened, they instinctively stood behind Chun Pingping as a replacement for his unhealthy back. They were people of the Overwatch Council, and the Overwatch Council was Chun Pingping's Overwatch Council. This dark and gloomy council had long been branded with countless dark and cold marks emanating from Chun Pingping's body. Even though Chun Pingping had been so glorious these few years, he was still unable to completely get rid of this dark and cold aura. If there really was such a thing as personal charisma in this world, if a dark personality also had charisma, then Chun Pingping was, without question, the most charismatic person in the world. He had all of his trusted subordinates dead set on him. Chun Pingping gently stroked the armrest of the wheelchair and gently tapped it, making a buzzing sound. He looked with relief at his subordinates, kneeling on the ground in front of him. There was not a trace of sadness at parting on his face. There was only satisfaction in his life's work. He wanted to return to Jingdo. He had never thought of leaving Jingdo. This had nothing to do with his work, the future of the Qing Kingdom, or the Overwatch Council. It only had to do with his own life. I'm just returning to the capital to talk about the past with the Emperor. What are you crying about? He furrowed his brows and swept his gaze around with disapproval. All of the Overwatch Council officials closed their mouths. A few of the crying officials lowered their heads in shame. These subordinates of the Overwatch Council could not understand. Even if the Emperor wanted to defeat the old director, he already had control of the entire situation. On the other side, the elite riders of the Jingdo garrison, led by General Shifei, had already become grasshoppers at the end of autumn. They couldn't even find a glimmer of courage. Why did the director still want to return to Jingdo to die? As for why the Emperor wanted to defeat the old director, these subordinates did not know. They just unconsciously thought that this was probably an inevitability of history. Did the old director know too much of the Emperor's dark secrets? Chun Pingping tiredly shooed these subordinates away, leaving behind only the deputy head of the Second Bureau who had been standing guard by his side. He looked at him calmly and said, "I've counted the days, and Ji still needs many days to return to the capital. Logically speaking, no one can tell him the news ahead of time." The official lowered his head and sighed. "None of us can change the decision you have made. Perhaps only Sir Fan Jr. can change all of this." "No, even he can't change this matter." Chun Pingping looked at him coldly. Chun Pingping looked at him coldly and said, "Don't think you can tell Fan Xian anything just because you are the fastest person in the world. I left you here to tell you that this is my order. In a moment, you will follow the Black Knights to send these 30 carriages straight into Jiangbei. You must enter Dongyi as quickly as possible and then find the person I told you about earlier. Through him, find 10 Family Village." The official had not thought that the old director would destroy the thoughts in the depths of his heart with one sentence. A glimmer of sorrow rose to his frozen face. Don't laugh and cry at the same time. Otherwise, this mask won't last long. Chun Pingping looked at him coldly. Wang Qinian, When you escaped from Dong Mountain on your own, you thought you were thinking for Fan Xian's sake. Have you thought about how much trouble you've brought Fan Xian and me? The masked official was Wang Qinian, who had been missing for 3 years. Fan Xian knew that he had disappeared under Chun Pingping's arrangements. He had secretly thought about investigating and thought about it for a long time. Presumably, he would never have guessed that Chun Pingping had arranged for Wang Qinian to be in the Overwatch Council. Wang Qinian took a deep breath and said, I still don't understand. Why do I want to go back? Don't you think that regardless of whether you live or die in the end, Sir Fan Jr. will be caught up in the trouble you don't want him to be caught up in? Chun Pingping didn't answer this question. He only looked coldly at his black carriages. He suddenly felt that this black color was pleasing to the eye and made one feel happy. The Jingdo garrison obediently moved aside. The 29 black carriages continued to advance along the road toward the east of the Qin Kingdom amidst the Overwatch Council officials' sadness, anger, and other complicated emotions. Surrounded by the cries of the beautiful women in Chun Garden, the carriages continued forward. The black wheelchair, however, was left behind. It was left alone. Chun Pingping touched the flying hair at his temples and said with a slight smile to the old servant behind him, Your body is better than mine. Why accompany me to death? The old servant grinned and didn't say anything. A portion of the black lines on the hill had already been cut off. A portion of the black knights had already begun to secretly follow the 30 black carriages and leave. There were still many black knights that remained coldly stationed on the hill, monitoring the movements of the Jingdo garrison. Shifei came to the wheelchair with a calm expression. After a moment of silence, he said, On behalf of the garrison, I thank the director for not killing me. Chun Pingping smiled and didn't say anything. Shifei lowered his head and asked, But I still don't understand why. If I wanted to leave earlier, what would you have done? Chun Pingping narrowed his eyes and looked at the dots of fire on the road in the distance. After a moment of silence, Shifei said, I'm His Majesty's subject. Even if I know I'm no match for them, I'll fight to the last man. Yes, this is a compromise. If I stay, fewer of your people will die, and fewer of the Overwatch Council's people will die. You should know that I have never thought my life was so worthless, Chun Pingping said with a smile. I'm an old man. My life is truly worthless. The Jingdo garrison is loyal to the Qin Kingdom. The Overwatch Council is loyal to the Qin Kingdom. I am also loyal to the Qin Kingdom. The old man in the wheelchair said gently, I've killed many people in my life, but I'm only willing to kill my enemies. I don't have the habit of killing my own people. Shifei did not understand. He did not understand the so-called loyalty to the Qin Kingdom. What were these 4,000 black knights that exceeded the limit? What's the big deal about disobeying the decree? Chun Pingping didn't say anything more. He just sat calmly. In his heart, the Qin Kingdom was the Qin Kingdom, and the emperor was the emperor. From many years ago, these two were not the same thing in his heart. He wanted to go back to Jingdo and ask that man, but he didn't want the entire Qin Kingdom to sink into turmoil because of his rupture with that man. He also didn't want the battle between the court and the Overwatch Council to cause countless Qin people to lose their homes. Thus, he chose to return to the capital and have the Overwatch Council retreat in front of the Jingdo garrison. When all was said and done, this was a battle between Chun Pingping and the Qin Emperor. Neither of them wanted this private matter to become a battle within the Qin Kingdom. Go back, Chun Pingping said quietly. Yes, director. All sorts of feelings rose in Shifei's heart. He waved his hand to summon the black carriage the Overwatch Council had left behind and bowed respectfully to Chun Pingping. Only then did he carefully carry the black wheelchair into the black carriage. At this moment, the line formed by the black knights on the hill suddenly became somewhat disorderly. Sitting by the carriage door, Chun Pingping seemed to sense something and abruptly turned his head to look. His gaze was incomparably sharp. In an instant, the black knights helplessly and sorrowfully calmed down. Chapter 692. On the hill in the night, The faint silver moon swam in and out of the clouds, making the place flicker between bright and dark. Jingu stared at the lonely carriage on the road at the foot of the mountain. A moment later, an angry snort came out of his silver mask. The black and incomparably sturdy spear hung beside his warhorse. His hands were not the only ones on the horse's reins. Ever since the rebellion in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qin calendar, the Qin family had been destroyed. In front of the tens of thousands of people in the royal palace, the silver-masked Jingu who had challenged Qin Hung had become a legendary figure. In particular, during these 3 years, Chun Pingping had purposely given up power to cultivate the new power of the Overwatch Council. In order to smoothly hand over this council to Fan Xian, as Fan Xian's trusted aide, Jingu had taken over the position of commander of the Black Knights of the 5th Bureau. In the instant the old man in the wheelchair at the foot of the mountain had been carried into the carriage, a glimmer of despair and anger rose in Jing Ji's heart. Squeezing his horse's belly, he prepared to lead his Black Knights to charge down and snatch the person. He could not just watch as Director Chen stepped onto the road to certain death on his way back to the capital. Back then, he had been bullied and humiliated in the army camp. During a routine drill, he had howled and attacked in self-defense. Unexpectedly, he had killed the eldest son of the Qin family. From that day on, he had been thrown into the Qin kingdom's death prison. The family and wife he had left behind his hometown had all been secretly killed by the Qin family in revenge. He was already a dead man, but unexpectedly, Qin Pingping secretly saved him and arranged for him to be part of the Shadow Knights. He wore a silver mask to hide his true appearance. For the sake of revenge, for the sake of repaying the debt of gratitude, he had been promoted to the position of deputy commander in the Shadow Knights. Fan Xian had given him a chance for revenge, so he was very grateful to Fan Xian. However, he knew that it was Chun Pingping who had given him a second life. In his heart, the silver-masked Jingu saw Director Chun as a second parent. On the mountain, Chun Pingping's wheelchair got into the carriage. A murderous intent surged in his heart, and he was about to rush down when the bald man beside him coldly pulled on the reins. Jingu looked back angrily. His eyes, as deep as the netherworld, stared at the baldy through the holes in the silver mask. However, he did not attack, because this baldy had more seniority in the Overwatch Council than him, and had once held a more important position. This baldy was the previous head of the 7th Bureau that Fan Xian had met in the Overwatch Council prison. The director has said that your mission is to take these 4,000 Black Knights and escort the carriages out of the country. Then, you must ensure that these 4,000 Black Knights are all handed over to Sir Fan Jr.'s hands without a single exception. The bald man's face appeared particularly old and tired. In the depths of his heart, he was just like Jingu, filled with sorrow and anger. However, he was Qin Pingping's most trusted old official. He had appeared among the Black Knights today on the old director's orders to suppress any possible unrest in the Black Knights. Do you know that if the director returns to the capital, he will never be able to come out again? Jingu looked at him coldly and slowly asked, enunciating each word. This is the director's will. Everything I have done is done in accordance with his will. The bald leader's expression was calm. He did not retreat a single step. Jingu stared in a daze at the road. He then saw Chun Pingping at the carriage door, looking back at him with a sharp gaze. His body trembled. He slowly raised his right hand and formed it into a fist, restraining the violent emotions in the hearts of his subordinates. After a long time, Jingu watched the black carriages slowly embark on the road back to the capital, while being surrounded or escorted by 3,000 elite riders of the Jingdo garrison. Jingu took a deep breath and slowly took off the silver mask on his face, revealing the terrifying and wretched wound. He didn't speak for a long time. He bid farewell to Chun Pingping. He knew that he would probably never see the old director again. The usually cold Jing Ji's eyes became slightly moist. The bald leader continued to stare in that direction in silence. There was a slight smile on his face, but a joyous desire to die gradually rose in his eyes. The bald leader dismounted from his horse and knelt down toward the quiet road. Very respectfully, he kowtowed. Jinga looked at his expression and felt slightly shocked. He knew that once this elder completed his task of watching him leave the country, he would probably leave with Director Chun. His heart felt slightly sorrowful, but he didn't say anything. He only looked at him calmly. He then dismounted from his horse and kowtowed in that direction. All of the Black Knights dismounted at the same time and knelt down densely on the small hill. They kowtowed toward the road that no longer had people or carriages and bid farewell to Director Chun. A moment later, Jingu carefully put on the silver mask on his face. In a raspy voice, he gave the order, "Retreat. Head east." These 4,000 Black Knights were the Overwatch Council's most powerful and reliable martial power. Regardless of how the Emperor wanted to deal with Qin Pingping or what methods the court would think of to weaken the Overwatch Council to offset any possible backlash from Qin Pingping, the Black Knights would always be the most important in the eyes of the court. Since Jingu accepted Qin Pingping's orders, he had to send these 4,000 Black Knights safely out of the Qin Kingdom's borders and into Fan Xian's hands. This was one of the last gifts Qin Pingping would give Fan Xian. The silver-masked Jinga knew that his mission was very important. Thus, when he led the Black Knights down the hill, his back was also very heavy. If Qin Pingping was truly willing to fight the Emperor head-on, these 4,000 Black Knights moving freely between the Qin Kingdom's provinces could, without question, start from within the Qin Kingdom and cut countless bone-deep wounds in the Qin Kingdom's abdomen. Additionally, there were spies the Overwatch Council had planted in the various ministries and border armies. It would not be difficult for Qin Pingping's final struggle to throw the entire Qin Kingdom into turmoil. However, Qin Pingping did not have such a choice. He would rather return to the capital alone to face the incomparably powerful Emperor than have the Overwatch Council subordinates loyal to him shed all pretenses of cordiality with the court and start a great battle. He protected the interests of the Qin court to the greatest extent. After all, he was loyal to the Qin Kingdom. Of course, someone as scheming and deep as Qin Pingping would not allow his Overwatch Council men to be toyed with by the court and the Emperor because of his return to the capital. He knew that under the Emperor's powerful strength and in front of the Qin Kingdom's powerful machinery, even if the Overwatch Council used all its strength, it could, at most, throw the world into turmoil. It would not be able to guarantee its own survival. He did not want the Overwatch Council men to come to any harm. Thus, he chose to follow the carriages out of the capital and to Dazhou. Then, he cleverly gathered the people he wanted to protect and the power he wanted to leave Fan Xian with to have them far away from Jingdou, a place of trouble. This included Wang Qinian, the accompanying beauties on the carriages, the Overwatch Council officials most loyal to him, the old head of the 7th Bureau who had followed him for 30 years, and, of course, the 4,000 Black Knights he had secretly managed for many years. These were all people Qin Pingping believed had to survive. There were also people Fan Xian needed. These people were silently and sorrowfully advancing in the dark night. They were preparing to cross the Qin Kingdom's borders and enter deep into Dongyi, which was already controlled by Fan Xian and the Great Prince. From then on, they would break away from the Qin Emperor's control and truly become an independent and powerful power in Fan Xian's hands. These powers were the bargaining chips Qin Pingping had left for Fan Xian. They could allow Fan Xian to negotiate with the Emperor. However, these bargaining chips had their own emotions and their own friendships. The Black Knights searched for mountain paths around the official roads and advanced like ghosts. Under the bald head's cold gaze, the silver-masked Jinggu could only give up on the idea of sending soldiers forward to slaughter the Jingdou garrison riders and take back the old director. On the carriages they were protecting, the officials and secret agents of the Overwatch Council had even deeper thoughts. Wang Qinian's disguised face was not only stiff, it also seemed to have aged. He glanced at Gauda beside him, covered in blood. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "The director returned to the capital, only to seek death." Gauda was still in a semi-conscious state, and the mute woman could not speak. She looked at the man in astonishment, not knowing who he was talking to. Outside the slowly advancing carriage, someone suddenly sighed. A normal-looking Overwatch Council official pushed open the carriage door and walked in. Sitting across from Wang Qinian, he said after a moment of silence, "Everyone knows, but no one can stop it. You should know that the director is doing this for the benefit of the council. He doesn't want the Qin kingdom to be shaken. He also doesn't want the duke to be involved. Zhongzhui, you've been following me. Are you afraid I'll go inform Sir Fan Jr.?" Wang Qinian had no intention of joking. He only looked coldly at his companion across from him and said each word clearly. If the director dies, it would be impossible for Sir Fan Jr. not to get involved. Since it is so, why not make this move earlier? In this world, the only person who can stop what happens in Jingdo is him. Sitting across from him was Zhongzhui. He and Wang Qinian were known as the two wings of the Overwatch Council. Traveling thousands of li and tracking, he was one of the two most powerful people in the world. He looked at Wang Qinian and calmly said, "Before the director left, he gave you strict orders to not inform Sir Fan Jr." Wang Qinian suddenly furrowed his brows and said, "I heard that Sir Fan Jr. has already left Dongyi." Along the way, he was chased by a number of Dongyi rebel soldiers. How did those Dongyi rebel soldiers know the Overwatch Council's return route? Zhongzhui didn't reply. Wang Qinian stared at him and said, "It was the old director who spread the news. He wanted to stop Fan Xian from returning to the capital early. He wanted to end all of this before Fan Xian returned." Zhongzhui silently agreed to this point. Wang Qinian slowly lowered his head and said, "It will take some time for Dazhou to return to the capital. If I leave the carriages now and rush to the east of Yanjing to inform Sir Fan Jr., he should still have time to return to Jingdo." A complicated emotion suddenly rose in Zhongzhui's eyes. "All these years, I've been following the old director. You've been following Sir Fan Jr. The mission the director gave me was to keep an eye on you." He sighed. The director is correct. Those who follow Sir Fan Jr. for a long time become different from us. They become overly impulsive and don't think about the results. Then, he said seriously, "I must carry out the director's orders. I cannot let you drag Sir Fan Jr. into this. You can stop me?" Wang Qinian stared at him and asked, "The two of us have never had a clear winner, even when you were a civil servant a few years ago." A strange smile rose to Zhongzhui's face. Immediately after, his smile froze on his face because the hilt of a knife had silently touched his waist, causing half of his body to go numb. Immediately after, Wang Qinian's palm turned into a knife and viciously chopped down on the back of his neck. He didn't even make a grunt before he fell onto the wooden planks of the carriage. The mute woman hugged her child and looked at this scene with a face full of shock. She was speechless. Holding the knife tightly, Gauda opened his eyes and breathed with great difficulty. He then said to Wang Qinian, "Let's go." Wang Qinian glanced at him and slowly nodded his head. Sir Fan Jr. said that living is the most important. I think he is also willing to let the old director live. Gauda coughed and coughed up blood. In a raspy voice, he said, "Time, nonsense." Wang Qinian gave an ugly smile. Turning around, he pushed aside the curtain of the black carriage and swept out like a gust of wind. The night was dark and heavy. The only person in the world who could catch up to him, Zhongzhui, was unconscious in the carriage. He was going to notify Fan Xian. Presumably, no one would be able to stop him. However, he didn't know if he would make it in time. When Fan Xian learned of everything that had happened in Jingdo and Dazhou and rushed back, would Qin Pingping still be able to sit safely in his wheelchair? The night was as cold as water and as black as ink. Mixing together, it was like ink in water, transforming into countless shapes of wind and sand that were difficult to grasp. A number of days later, the riders of the Jingdo garrison finally rushed back to the outskirts of Jingdo. Because there was a black carriage that could not move very fast, the entire speed was suppressed to a very slow pace. However, no one had any objections. They even felt that the slower they went, the better. The commander of the garrison, Shi Fei, had been sitting in the carriage with Qin Pingping like a filial junior. He served Qin Pingping's food and water, daily life, and rest. Usually, he chatted with him about the Qing kingdom's past and future, the funny political stories in court, or the elusive rumors in the palace. It was truly like an old official had been taken back to Jingdo by his successor to retire. However, everyone knew that was not the truth. It was already autumn, when the Jingdo garrison, who had invited Chun Pingping back, rushed back to Jingdo. They purposely chose the darkest hour before dawn. There is a sliver of white on the eastern horizon, but it was not very bright. It was unable to display the clear autumn sky of Jingdo in front of everyone's eyes. Everyone could only smell the extremely light air, so light that there was a thread of dryness moving back and forth between their mouths and noses. Other than the dozen or so injured, the rest of the 3,600 riders surrounded the black carriage and arrived outside Jingdo's Jingyang Gate. Presumably, along the way, Shifei had already reported the situation in Dazhou to the Bureau of Military Affairs or Internal Court in Jingdo through top-secret channels. Thus, when the densely packed riders arrived in front of Jingdo's gates in the dark, the soldiers of the 13 city gate guards at the eastern gate were not shocked at all. They also did not raise any alarm signals that they should not have. It was quiet above and below the city walls. In the darkness, one could occasionally hear the sound of horses' hooves kicking. The patch of whiteness in the east only shone on the tall walls of Jingdo, making the topmost layer of black bricks give off a somber sound. The bird that had risen the hardest in the morning flew quickly in front of the city walls and let out a joyful cry. A heavy creak rang out. For once, the Jingdo city gates opened before the hour was up. Under the effect of the mechanism, the heavy city gates opened up a path that could allow a carriage to pass through. It was pitch black. It was impossible to see clearly what dangers were hidden inside. The soldiers of the 13 city gate guards stood on the city walls and looked warily and curiously at the city gate. They didn't know what had happened. Why was it that from their immediate superior to the strange appearance of the Jingdo garrison soldiers outside, it was as if they were facing a great enemy? All of the handover work was completed in a frightening silence. Under the control of the old servant, the black carriage slowly entered Jingdo's city gates. Until now, this carriage was still under the control of the old servant of the Overwatch Council. This carriage was still under the control of the old cripple in the carriage. None of the important military officials inside and outside the city dared to forcefully take the position of the driver of the carriage. No one lifted the curtain to verify the identity of the old man inside. Shifei silently watched the carriage enter Jingyang Gate and then slowly close the city gates. He knew his mission had finally been completed. Before he left, he had thought that the Jingdo garrison would have to sacrifice countless lives to complete his mission. Yet he had done it so easily. There was nothing else for him to do. Regardless of the emperor's anger at him not being able to completely complete his mission, Shifei did not care. He only stared in a daze at the tightly closed heavy city gates. Countless complicated emotions rose in his heart. The civil officials of the Qing court all felt disgust toward the Overwatch Council and the old cripple in the Overwatch Council other than fear. They thought that the old cripple was the emperor's old black dog, a terrifying fellow who bit everyone he met. In the eyes of the major military figures, the Overwatch Council was their most loyal, reliable, and powerful partner. Although they also had boundless fear of Chun Pingping, Shifei suddenly felt that this old man, who would rather return to the capital alone than have the Overwatch Council and the military fight a great battle, was worthy of his respect. He was silent for a long time. He then slowly waved his hand and led the 3,000 Jingdo garrison soldiers, who all had complicated emotions and had escaped the joy of their lives, slowly away from the heavy city walls and the man-eating city gates. The black horse carriage slowly entered Jingyang Gate, and the heavy gate slowly closed. A few people slowly approached the carriage. It was currently the darkest time before dawn, and the light was extremely dim. It was impossible to clearly see the faces of those people. The people in charge of waiting outside Jingyang Gate were all top figures in the Qing court. One was Eunuch Yao, who had been sent by the palace. Another was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong, who controlled the armies of the world. The last was the traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, He Zhongwei. The three of them approached the black carriage. For a moment, no one spoke. In the end, it was Yi Zhong who spoke. He gazed at the carriage and said in an even voice, "Director, it has been hard on you to return." Eunuch Yao calmly said, "Director, please follow me into the palace to see the emperor." He Zhongwei stood to the side and didn't speak. His face was calm. He maintained the silence he should maintain at this moment. There was silence in the carriage. After a long time, the old man slowly sighed and warmly said, "A lonely old man returning to the capital has disturbed your peace. I am truly apologetic." The carriage slowly moved. Under the collective escort of internal court eunuchs and military aces, it moved along the street under Jingyang Gate toward the royal palace in the center of Jingdo. It seemed that the Overwatch Council in Jingdo did not know that their ancestor had already returned to Jingdo and was about to face the emperor's towering anger. Even the officials in court and the Jingdo people with sharp senses did not know of this. It was a dark dawn. The trees on both sides of the street under Jingyang Gate were like countless boats swaying in the cool autumn wind. The street led directly to the royal palace. There were no pedestrians on either side. Presumably, it had long been purged and was under the highest level of martial law. It was empty and desolate. Only the black horse carriage was moving forward. It was moving forward in a lonely manner. It traveled until it reached the front of the brilliant royal palace. Coincidentally, the sun finally broke free of the restraints of the earth and leaped out, illuminating the royal palace. The fire-like warm golden light just happened to envelop the black carriage. Chapter 693. A few files of varying thickness lay quietly on the table in the royal study. In these short days, they had been flipped through countless times by that pair of steady eyes. Then, as if they had been forgotten, they were placed there with unusual silence. Time was not enough for dust to cover these files. However, the cool air of early autumn made the pages of these files curl up like they had been roasted by fire. That pair of deep and scorching eyes slowly moved away from the scroll, cast outside into the dim and dazzling light of the palace before dawn. The light from the east had already illuminated the highest brick on the walls of Jingdo, but it was still unable to shine into the royal palace, which was deeply locked in darkness by the city walls and palace walls. The Qing emperor expressionlessly picked up the teacup by his hand and took a sip. The tea was cold. The eunuchs who usually served by his side did not have the courage to come in and change it to hot as usual. An entire night had passed, and all he drank was cold tea. Like a fish drinking water, only one knew if it was warm or cold. When the cold tea entered his chest and stomach, it turned into a burning stream of heat. Was it anger that was difficult to suppress? Was it the pain of being deceived by someone he trusted? Or was it a sense of humiliation that he had never felt before? That old dog had hidden it from him for decades. The angrier he got, the calmer he became. The Qing emperor was no longer as angry as he had been a few days ago. His expression and gaze were as calm as two pools of ice water, extremely cold and calm. It was not like an ancient well. It was like water that was about to turn to ice, blindly cold. This coldness spread around the royal study, making everyone who stopped outside feel a fear that came from the depths of their hearts. A familiar sound faintly rang out in the distance. It was the sound of a wheelchair rolling over the stone tiles of the royal palace. The special round chair and the cracks between the stone tiles rubbed endlessly. The width of the stone tiles was fixed, and the distance between the wheelchair and the stone tiles was fixed. Thus, the rhythm and timing of the sound of the wheelchair rolling over the stone tiles were also fixed. This kind of fixed rhythm had rung out countless times in the quiet royal palace during these decades. Each time the Qing emperor had something important to do or just wanted to talk, the sound of the wheelchair would travel from outside the palace into the palace, all the way into the royal study. In recent years, the sound of the wheelchair has lessened. That old black dog hides in the Chun garden to enjoy his life, leaving me alone in this cold palace to suffer. However, 3 years ago, when he had to deal with Yunrui and those 3 strange creatures, the wheelchair had entered the palace twice. The Qing emperor's expression was indifferent. In an instant, he thought of many past events. He then slowly raised his head. When his calm and deep gaze landed on the tightly shut wooden door of the imperial study, the sound of the wheelchair rubbing against the stone floor stopped in the imperial study. The emperor's gaze suddenly became complicated. Eunuch Yao's trembling voice rang out in the royal study. It was not that the head of the eunuchs had purposely used such a terrified voice to express the importance he attached to the figure in the wheelchair. Inside and outside the royal study, the coldness that the Qing emperor naturally gave off with his great grandmaster realm had already controlled the hearts of most people. The door to the royal study opened. A few eunuchs carefully and fearfully carried the black wheelchair in. Then, led by Eunuch Yao, they left as quickly as they could. This group of internal court eunuchs left the royal study very, very far away. They walked all the way to where the royal study went around the stone arch garden gate and led directly to Taiji Palace. Eunuch Yao wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and glanced at Commander Yi and Scholar He waiting outside the garden gate. He didn't say anything. There wasn't even a hint of expression. Yi Zhong's expression was heavy. He only sighed in his heart. After these top figures of the Qing kingdom escorted the black carriage into the royal study, they all consciously hid far away. They knew that under the emperor's cold envelopment, he would not want anyone to hear every word he said to the person in the wheelchair. Old Director Chen returned safely and gently. Although they were not used to such an easy resolution, although they knew old Director Chen was not a simple and terrifying person, including Yi Chong and Eunuch Yao, they were not worried that anything alarming would happen in the royal study. The emperor was a great grandmaster. After Dong Mountain, no one in the world would be able to harm him. The royal study's doors were tightly shut, cutting off all the air, sound, light, smell, and autumn outside. Only the emperor, who was sitting ramrod straight on the couch, and Chen Pingping, who was casually sitting in a wheelchair, remained. The two of them hid in the little building, cutting off the storms of the Qing kingdom outside. The storms of the Qing kingdom these decades have been stirred up by these two powerful people. The Qing emperor looked calmly at the old man in the wheelchair for an indeterminable amount of time. It was only when the wrinkles on Chen Pingping's face were like chrysanthemums under the hanging temple that he faintly said, He Zhongwei is secretly investigating Gouda and wants to defeat Fan Xian. I knew of this long ago. The internal court sent 3 people over. When you passed by Dazhou a few days ago, He Qigong should have been there. Did you see him? If there was someone else present and saw this scene, they would certainly be shocked. The emperor had mobilized so many people. All of the important yamens in Jingdo were on standby. The icy young master of the Overwatch Council had also begun to carry out the emperor's edict and began internal pressure. Only then did he manage to invite the old cripple in the black wheelchair back to Jingdo. Everyone knew that there was no turning point between the ruler and his official. However, the emperor's first words to Chen Pingping were an unremarkable name. Chen Pingping was not surprised. He understood his emperor too well. He smiled slightly and said in a slightly sharp and raspy voice, When I was sent to King Cheng's manor, He Qigong was still young. I saw him once outside Dazhou. Presumably, he doesn't remember me at all. That's not strange. The name Chen Wuchang has disappeared from the royal palace for a long time. The emperor nodded. The sleeve of his dragon robe flew up. A cup of tea slowly left the table and flew in front of Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping accepted it and respectfully nodded his head in greeting. Holding the scalding hot teacup, he sighed comfortably and said, It's best to drink tea hot. The emperor used his fingers to pick up his icy cold teacup and took a small sip. Calmly, he said, When people leave, the tea gets cold. Otherwise, how could He Qigong not recognize you? Chen Pingping shook his head and said, Other than Hong Xixiang, not many people knew that I had once stayed in the palace. The emperor's eyelids lowered slightly and revealed a glimmer of mockery. Later, you even made a fake beard and stuck it to your chin. Of course, you didn't want others to know that you were a eunuch. Chen Pingping's expression did not change. He lowered his head slightly and lightly said, "It was only many years later that I understood that I had always been a eunuch. There was no need to hide it from the world. But, in the end, you still managed to hide it from the world." The emperor placed the cold teacup on the table and stared into Chen Pingping's eyes. Back then, you were sent to the manor by the palace to monitor father's movements. However, not even the palace thought that you would secretly reveal your identity to me and be willing to help my manor rise up. In the end, even old eunuch Hong in the palace was persuaded by you to stand on father's side. That was all because of you. Thus, the identity of a permanent eunuch in the palace back then was a great service to you, me, and the Qing kingdom. Why do you always keep this matter in mind? The reason the previous emperor was able to ascend to the throne had little to do with me. Chen Pingping called himself a servant. Unlike in the past, there was not much sense of inferiority in this servant. He only followed the past and said it naturally. He slowly raised his head and looked directly into the Qing emperor's cold eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "That was because someone killed 2 princes. That was why it was King Cheng's turn to sit on the throne, and why it was possible for your majesty to have the vast territory you have today." The emperor's gaze suddenly became sharp. It was clear that he did not want to hear anything related to this matter. "But why did you betray the nobles in the palace and throw yourself into the manor to be loyal to me?" he asked. Chen Pingping gazed at the Qing emperor with a not-quite-there smile like he was looking at a great joke. After a long time, he slowly said, "Your Majesty, at that time, you were still a young man. Your nature was clear and broad. You treated people sincerely and your subordinates well. However, I was born with a strange personality. As long as someone treated me well, I would treat them well." The emperor fell silent. He sat ramrod straight on the soft couch, as if he was still savoring Chen Pingping's words. His sharp gaze became like the long day at the beginning of autumn. Gradually, he revealed his cool side. The corners of his lips twitched slightly. Mockingly, he said, "So, you still know that I treated you well." Back then, the old prince didn't have any status in the court and didn't have any support in the court. Prince Cheng's manor wasn't big and unremarkable. I was actually the most useless little eunuch in the palace, so I was sent to the prince's manor. For someone as powerful as Hong Xiang, of course, he was always at the side of the nobles in the palace. Chen Pingping seemed to be thinking of many things of the past. He slowly sighed and said, "However, being small has its advantages. Simple has its advantages." At that time, there were 3 big boys and 1 little boy. They did their best. Mother Fan would occasionally yell at them from the side, but no one seemed to think it was bad. At that time, King Jing was still young. No one wanted to pay attention to him. The emperor raised an eyebrow and said, "Even if Fan Jian and him joined forces to attack me, in the end, they were still stopped by you. When the 2 of us joined forces, no one has ever been a match for us. It is still the same today." After these words left his mouth, Chen Pingping and the emperor fell silent at the same time. After a long time, Chen Pingping gently touched the armrest of the wheelchair and sighed. "After all, Fan Jian was your majesty's milk brother. In the end, I am only a servant. At the time, I didn't think much. I just wanted to protect you." The lines of the Qing emperor's face gradually softened, but his gaze drifted into the distance. It was as if it had drifted to the scene of ruler and official holding hands without any disloyalty. Faintly, he said, "I have to admit, during those years, you protected me many times. If it wasn't for you, I don't know how many times I would have died." After saying that, the corner of his eye suddenly caught a glimpse of the dossiers on the table. His eyes paused for a moment, and he gently took out the first one. He slowly opened it and read through the contents of the dossiers, including his sister, his son, and many, many other things. At the beginning of the Qing kingdom's expansion, it did not disturb the Wei kingdom's iron riders, So you and I were both careless and spied on the Chun Kingdom, which is now Yinjing's defenses. We were surrounded at Ding Mountain by Zhang Qingfeng's foremost killing general, Hu Yu. That person's archery skills were very good. The Qing Emperor sighed. After all these years, the only person better than Hu Yu's archery skills is Xiaoyi. When he spoke of northern governor Yan Xiaoyi, who had once betrayed him, there was not a glimmer of hatred or anger in the Qing Emperor's tone. There was only pity. The Qing Emperor was a person who cherished talent and was extremely confident. He did not fear Yan Xiaoyi at all, which was why he showed such emotions. However, looking at the arrangements he had made for the Overwatch Council these days, in his heart, Chun Pingping was a person who far surpassed any other official. He turned his head and looked at Chun Pingping in the wheelchair. That day, if you had not sacrificed yourself to block Hu Yu's arrow, perhaps I would have died on the spot. Chun Pingping calmly replied, "This is my duty as a servant." The Qing Emperor smiled self-mockingly and glanced at the file in his hand. On it was written that during the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago, Chun Pingping had secretly allowed the eldest princess to lead troops into Jingdo and successfully besiege the royal palace. Although the Overwatch Council's actions were meticulous and there was not much evidence on this file, given the Emperor's eyesight, he could clearly see the great evil hidden within. He casually tossed the file to the side and ignored it. Then, he picked up another one. He squinted his eyes and read it again. He said, "At the floating temple, why did you want to have the shadow assassinate you? Earlier, it had been a gentle wind and drizzling rain reminiscing about the past. Now, an accusatory voice suddenly rang out in the royal study. A faint stench of blood gradually filled the air. However, Chun Pingping seemed to know nothing. Respectfully, he replied, "I wanted to see just what your majesty's final trump card was." "You wanted to see my trump card?" The emperor's gaze stared at the wrinkles on Chun Pingping's face. After a long silence, he calmly said, "Looks like wanting me to die is something you've thought about for a long time." Chun Pingping did not open his mouth to reply. He only smiled warmly and silently admitted to this great crime. "Is the shadow really Sigu Jian's younger brother?" The Qing emperor asked. "Your majesty's gaze is divine. That day you guessed the shadow's true background in one gulp. I truly admire you." Chun Pingping said he admired him, but he didn't know if he truly admired him in his heart. The Qing emperor closed his eyes and thought for a bit. He then tossed the file to the side and said, "During the first northern expedition, just as I was breaking through, I suddenly went berserk and was trapped by Zhang Qingfeng's army in the mountains. I was already at the end of my rope. If you had not led the Black Knights and risked your life to save me and exchange your body for mine along the way, I would probably have died 8 or 10 times over." Chun Pingping's gaze followed the Qing emperor's hand movements. He watched as he tossed the file regarding the truth of the hanging temple assassination to the side. The smile in his eyes grew larger and larger until it withered. It was incomparably lonely. There was also a glimmer of mockery in the loneliness. "Your Majesty, don't keep calculating like this. To use the merit of saving the emperor in exchange for a great crime of deceiving or assassinating the emperor, regardless of whether it is from the perspective of Qing law or council regulations, I have taken a great advantage." Chun Pingping's expression calmed. He looked at the emperor and coldly said, "During these decades, I cannot remember how many times I have saved your majesty. I have never had the extravagant hope of using these merits to offset my own death sentence. Using a great merit to exchange for a great crime." Chun Pingping narrowed his eyes and said lightly and mockingly, "That was the little eunuch in the story she once told. However, I am not that little eunuch. Your majesty is also not that foreign emperor. Why waste so much time? You think I am wasting time?" The emperor's voice became icy, but his gaze burned. He stared at Chun Pingping like he was staring at a dead person. "In the hearts of the people, you are an old black dog at my side. After raising a dog for a long time, one also has feelings. Of course, your majesty has feelings for me. These years, the honor and power you have given me is no longer something a normal official can enjoy. Chen Pingping leaned slightly against the wheelchair and gazed coldly back at the emperor. Enunciating each word, he said, "However, for you to say such things at this time, it is probably because you want to find a good reason for killing a dog to comfort your own feelings. Did you not deserve to be killed?" The Qing emperor's anger made him laugh. He threw his head back and laughed loudly. The laughter passed out of the royal study and charged straight into the silent royal palace. There was a rare anger in the laughter. He turned and grabbed the files on the table and threw them fiercely at Chen Pingping. The files of different thickness landed on Chen Pingping's body and the wheelchair, making slapping sounds. The Qing emperor's gaze became very deep and cold. He stared at Chen Pingping's face and said each word clearly. "You want to kill me, and you also want to kill my son. How despicable of you to force me to kill my own son. Do you, a shameless eunuch, not deserve to be killed?" Chen Pingping slowly brushed away the pages on his body with a slight smile and a glimmer of pleasure as he admired the rare loss of composure the most powerful ruler in the world had in his life. This was probably one of his greatest wishes on this trip back to the capital. The dark desire for revenge that had been entangled at the bottom of his heart for decades, as well as the indescribable disappointment and sadness towards His Majesty, gathered together, causing the old cripple's state of mind to become so complicated. "Your Majesty, if you didn't want to kill your own son, how could I force you to do these things?" Chen Pingping looked at the emperor and faintly said, "When all is said and done, I only want to kill your Majesty. As for the people of the Li royal family in the palace, I only want them to accompany you in death." The emperor calmed down and became cold. He shook off his rare anger. A supreme being in the mortal world, a great grandmaster of martial arts, had revealed such a mortal side in front of Chen Pingping. It could only be said that the decades of interaction and trust between ruler and official had long become a spiritual need that the Qing emperor could not shake off. This spiritual need suddenly became an illusion in an instant. Furthermore, behind the illusion hid the poison of betrayal. Even he found it difficult to endure the impact of such emotions. He looked coldly at Chen Pingping and said, "What I am most angry about is not that you want to kill me or all of my sons. What I am most angry about is that since you have already left Jingdo, why did you still come back? Even in such a situation, I still left you a way out. As long as you are willing to leave, I will not keep you." The emperor looked at him coldly. His deep eyes were like an angry old man from ancient times. There was boundless power in the calmness. "If I really wanted to kill you in one move, I would do it myself. I would not have those useless soldiers do this work. However, why did you come back? Why must you force me to personally kill you?" This was a wondrous and strange sentence. The major figures outside the royal study, including General Shi Fei, who had already returned to the garrison camp, could not guess the emperor's intentions. They did not know that the so-called change in Dazhou was still a test to the emperor and Chen Pingping's intentions regarding the last bit of trust between the emperor and Chen Pingping, the ruler and official. In the entire world, probably only Chen Pingping could understand. If he had left with the Black Knights in Dingzhou, it meant that he felt guilty toward the emperor and was unable to face him. However, he did not leave. He returned to Jingdo and gazed coldly and fearlessly at the emperor's face. His heart was open and clear of guilt as he forced the emperor to kill the most loyal official in the history of the Qin kingdom. After a long time, Chen Pingping's eyes were like knives as he stared at the emperor and asked, "Back then, did you give her any way out?" "I returned to the capital to ask the emperor one thing. Why did you kill her?" You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.